In a single day, one man would receive 4 messages, each more devastating than the one before it. His working life would be destroyed, most of his servants would be killed, every one of his children would die. And when the last messenger finished speaking, the man at the center of the disaster would still have no idea why any of it had happened. His name was Job. Before loss became inseparable from his name, he possessed almost everything his world could recognize as evidence of a flourishing life. He had wealth, standing, children, and an honorable reputation. More important to him than any of these, he lived with reverence toward God. Yet his integrity would become the very reason his life was placed under scrutiny. Forces beyond his sight would raise a question about him, and Job would be made to answer it without ever being told that the question had been asked. Job lived in the land of Uz. He was blameless and upright, a man who feared God and turned away from evil. Blameless did not mean that he was presented as something more than human. It described the settled direction of his life. His conduct matched his devotion. He honored God and deliberately rejected what was wrong. His household was large. Job had 7 sons and 3 daughters. His possessions were larger still: 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 female donkeys. A yoke counted a working pair, so 500 yoke meant 1,000 oxen available for labor. Alongside these animals was a very great number of servants. Job was not simply comfortable. Among all the people of the East, he was the greatest man. The scale of his prosperity mattered because nearly every part of it was active. The sheep represented vast living wealth. The camels gave his household exceptional capacity for movement and transport. The oxen worked and the donkeys grazed near them. Servants cared for the animals and carried out the labor of Job's estate. His prosperity was spread across different herds, different tasks, and many human hands. It was broad enough to appear secure. His children also had an established life together. Each son held a feast in his own house on his appointed day. The sons sent invitations to their 3 sisters, who came to eat and drink with them. The gatherings moved among the homes of the 7 brothers, forming a repeated cycle of shared meals. Job watched over this family life with deliberate spiritual care. When a cycle of feasting had run its course, he sent for his children and consecrated them. Then he rose early in the morning and offered a burnt offering for each one. He explained his reason. His children could have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Job did not accuse them of doing so. He acted because the possibility concerned him, and because an inward offense would not necessarily have been visible to anyone else. 10 children meant 10 offerings. He did this regularly. That pattern reveals the world Job occupied before the disaster. He did not worship God only because trouble had frightened him. Reverence shaped his life while he was prosperous. He did not wait for public wrongdoing before caring about the moral condition of his household. Even during days of feasting, he remembered that what happened within the heart mattered before God. Then the view shifts beyond anything Job could see. The sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and among them came Satan, the accuser. The Lord asked where he had come from. The accuser answered that he had been roaming through the earth and walking back and forth upon it. The Lord then directed his attention to Job. Had he considered this servant? There was no one like him on the earth, blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil. The qualities that defined Job in Uz were known in this gathering as well. His integrity was not merely a reputation produced by wealth or influence. God himself identified it. The accuser did not begin by disputing Job's behavior. He challenged the reason behind it. Did Job fear God for nothing? The question attacked the meaning of every faithful act Job had performed. The accuser pointed to the protection surrounding him, his household, and everything he possessed. God had blessed the work of Job's hands. His livestock had spread through the land. Under those conditions, reverence brought visible rewards. The accusation was that Job's devotion was an exchange. He honored God because God had made honoring him profitable. Remove the benefits, and the true value of Job's faith would be exposed. The accuser proposed a test. Let God stretch out his hand and strike everything Job possessed. Faced with that loss, the accuser declared Job would curse God to his face. This was a direct challenge to Job's integrity, but Job did not hear it. He was not summoned to defend himself. He was not warned that the shape of his life was about to change. He continued in Uz, while the meaning of his worship was debated beyond his knowledge. The Lord placed Job's possessions under the accuser's power. Everything Job had was made vulnerable, but one clear restraint remained. The accuser was not to stretch out his hand against Job himself. The limit was precise. Job's property, labor, servants, and family stood within the permitted reach. His own body did not. Then the accuser departed from the presence of the Lord. The catastrophe began on a day when Job's sons and daughters were together, eating and drinking wine in the house of their oldest brother. Nothing in their gathering distinguished this meal from the family pattern already established. While they feasted, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys were feeding beside them. Job's estate was in motion. The animals were working and grazing. The servants were at their tasks. Then a survivor reached Job. The Sabeans had attacked. They seized the oxen and donkeys and killed the servants with the sword. Only one man had escaped to report what had happened. The first message alone represented an enormous collapse. 1,000 working oxen and 500 donkeys were gone. The servants with them were dead. The Sabeans had not damaged one isolated corner of Job's wealth. They had taken the animals connected to cultivation and labor. The messenger had not finished speaking before another arrived. This survivor brought news from a different part of Job's estate. Fire from heaven had fallen upon the sheep and the servants and burned them up. Again, one servant alone had escaped to tell Job. 7,000 sheep were lost, together with the people tending them. The first disaster had come through armed raiders. The second descended from above. Job was given no time to absorb the difference. Before the second messenger had finished, a third came. The Chaldeans had formed 3 raiding parties and descended upon the camels. They took all 3,000 of them and killed the servants with the sword. Once more, only one man escaped to carry the news. Job's working wealth was now effectively gone. The oxen and donkeys had been seized, the sheep had been consumed, the camels had been taken. The servants attached to these herds had been slaughtered or burned, apart from the few survivors standing before him. The pattern of the reports made the ruin impossible to contain. Each messenger arrived while the previous one was still speaking. Each survivor carried a complete disaster. Each declared himself the only one who had escaped from his group. Before Job could respond to one loss, the next loss overtook it. Yet the most terrible message had not arrived. While the third survivor was still speaking, a fourth entered. He came from the house where Job's children had gathered. A great wind had swept in from across the wilderness. It struck the 4 corners of the house. The structure collapsed upon the young people inside, and they died. The messenger alone had escaped to tell Job. In the first 3 reports, Job lost the vast system that made him the greatest man in the East. In the 4th, the disaster passed beyond possessions. All 7 sons and all 3 daughters had been together in one place. None survived. The repeated family feasts that had displayed their life together had also brought them beneath one roof on the day the wind came. The oldest brother's house, which had held their shared meal, became the place of their death. Job had begun that day with 10 children, thousands of animals, and a great body of servants. By the time 4 survivors had delivered their messages, none of his children remained alive. His herds were gone. Most of the servants connected to them were dead. The broad distribution of his wealth had offered no protection because the calamities had struck its separate parts in rapid succession. He had no view of the gathering where his integrity had been challenged. He did not know the accusation that prosperity had purchased his devotion. He did not know the boundary that had been drawn around his own body. He knew only what the messengers had seen: raiders, fire, another raid, a great wind, a collapsed house, and death. Job rose. He tore his robe and shaved his head, visible acts of mourning suited to the scale of what he had heard. Then he fell to the ground. The greatest man in the East now possessed no power to reverse a single report. He could not recover the animals, restore the dead servants, raise the house, or bring his sons and daughters back from death. On the ground, Job worshipped. He spoke of the beginning and end of human possession. He had come naked from his mother's womb, and naked he would depart. Everything held between those two boundaries had been received rather than owned forever. "The Lord gave," Job said, "and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Job did not know the immediate cause behind what had happened. Sabaeans had carried off one part of his wealth. Fire had destroyed another. Chaldeans had taken a third. Wind had killed his children. Yet in the moment when all visible order collapsed, Job addressed the Lord, whose name he had honored before calamity came. His blessing did not make the losses smaller. He had torn his robe and removed his hair because his grief was real. Worship did not cancel mourning. It occurred within it. The same man who fell beneath the weight of the news refused to turn that grief into the curse the accuser had predicted. In all of this, Job did not sin. He did not charge God with wrongdoing. The first challenge had therefore failed. Job had lost the rewards that were supposed to explain his reverence, yet he continued to bless God. His integrity survived a day that left his former life almost unrecognizable. But the test had also stopped at the exact boundary God had established. Everything placed within the accuser's power had been struck: possessions, servants, and children. One thing remained untouched: Job himself. Then the sons of God again came to present themselves before the Lord, and the accuser came among them. As before, the Lord asked where he had come from. The answer was the same. He had been roaming through the earth and walking back and forth upon it. The Lord again directed his attention to Job. The description had not changed. Job remained blameless and upright, fearing God and turning away from evil. But now the Lord added the result of the disaster. Job still held firmly to his integrity, even though the accuser had incited the Lord against him to destroy him without cause. Those words established what Job himself had been unable to see. His suffering was not evidence that he had secretly lived as an evil man. The calamities had not exposed a hidden offense that explained their arrival. From the Lord's own judgment, Job remained a man of integrity, and the destruction had come without cause in Job's conduct. The accuser answered with another challenge: skin for skin. A man would surrender everything he possessed in exchange for his life. The loss of animals, servants, and even children had not reached the one possession the accuser now identified as decisive: Job's own flesh. "Stretch out a hand against his bone and flesh," the accuser declared, and Job would curse God to his face. The accusation narrowed. Job had continued to worship after losing everything around him, but the accuser rejected that response as insufficient proof. As long as Job himself remained physically secure, his devotion had not endured the deepest possible test. The Lord placed Job within the accuser's power. Again, the permission came with a restraint. Job's body could be struck, but his life had to be spared. The accuser departed from the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job with painful sores. They covered him from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. The suffering was no longer delivered through messengers describing losses elsewhere. It occupied his entire body. Job took a broken piece of pottery and used it to scrape himself. He sat among the ashes. The man, once surrounded by an immense household, now sat in physical misery, holding a fragment of pottery against diseased skin. Every movement of the piece crossed another part of the affliction, because the sores extended from his feet to his head. His possessions had already been taken. His children had already died. Now even his own body had become a place of pain. His wife spoke to him. "Are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die." Her words joined the two boundaries the accuser had been testing. Job's integrity was still visible, and death appeared to stand at the end of a curse. She placed the decision directly before him. Abandon the devotion he continued to hold, speak against God, and die. Job answered her without pretending that the suffering was good. "You are speaking as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we receive good from God and not receive adversity?" Job and his wife had received much that was good. They had shared a household of 10 children and extraordinary wealth. Now the children were dead, the wealth was gone, and Job sat among ashes, scraping sores from head to foot. He did not deny the difference between those conditions. He asked whether receiving from God meant accepting only one side of human life. His response also preserved a distinction his wife's challenge had pressed him to erase. Adversity had come from God's permitted rule over his life, but Job would not answer it by cursing the giver of the good he had once received. In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. The accuser had predicted a spoken curse. Job had instead rebuked the suggestion. He was wounded in his flesh, stripped of his former life, and confronted by his wife. Yet the curse still did not come. News of Job's calamity reached 3 of his friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. Each came from his own place. They arranged to meet together so that they could go to Job, mourn with him, and comfort him. Their purpose was compassionate. They had heard that evil had come upon their friend, and they came to share his grief. But when they raised their eyes from a distance, they did not recognize him. The sores had transformed the appearance of the man they knew. The sight of him produced an immediate response. They raised their voices and wept. Each tore his robe. Then they threw dust into the air over their heads. They joined Job on the ground and remained there with him for 7 days and 7 nights. During that entire time, not one of them spoke a word to him. They saw that his suffering was very great. For 7 days, their companionship required no explanation. They did not begin by assigning blame or constructing an answer. Their torn robes, dust-covered heads, tears, and placed beside Job openly acknowledged the magnitude of his grief. Job's losses could be counted, but the friends now faced the man who had endured them. They saw the affliction that had made him unrecognizable. They sat where he sat. Day followed night, and night followed day, until the 7 days were complete. Then Job opened his mouth. The words that emerged were not the curse against God predicted by the accuser. Job cursed the day of his own birth. "Let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said, 'A boy is conceived.'" He reached backward beyond the disasters, beyond his wealth and family, beyond every choice he had made, to the day his life began. If that day had perished, then the man now sitting among ashes would never have entered the world where such suffering could reach him. Job called for darkness to claim the day. "Let God above give it no regard. Let no light shine upon it. Let darkness and the shadow of death take it back. Let clouds settle over it and blackness overwhelm it." He separated that day from the ordinary movement of time. It did not deserve a place among the days of the year or a number among the months. As for the night of his conception, let deep darkness seize it. Let it be barren. Let no joyful cry be heard within it. Job called upon those who knew how to curse a day, those ready to rouse Leviathan, to direct their curse against that night. Let its twilight stars remain dark. Let it wait for daylight and receive none. Let it never see the first signs of dawn. The reason was personal and precise. That night had not closed the doors of his mother's womb. It had not hidden sorrow from his eyes. Job was not asking for his present pain alone to end. He was imagining the removal of the beginning that had made all later pain possible. The day once associated with birth and joy was now condemned because it had opened the way to everything he had seen and lost. From cursing the day, Job turned to questions about his birth. Why had he not died as he came from the womb? Why had knees received him? Why had breasts been there to nurse him? Each act that had preserved his infant life now appeared to him as one more step toward the misery in which he sat. Had he died at birth, he said, he would now be lying down in quiet. He would be asleep and at rest. In death, he pictured himself alongside kings and counselors of the earth, men who built desolate places for themselves, and princes whose houses had been filled with silver and gold. Rank and possessions made no difference in the rest, Job described. Those who had ruled and accumulated treasure arrived at the same stillness he had been denied at birth. He asked why he had not been like a child hidden in the earth before birth, like infants who never saw the light. They had not entered the life whose bitterness he now knew. There, he said, the wicked ceased from troubling, and the weary found rest. Prisoners were at ease together, and no longer heard the voice of the taskmaster. The small and the great were in the same place, and the servant was free from his master. Job's words moved across every level of human power. Kings, counselors, princes, the wicked, the exhausted, prisoners, taskmasters, servants, and masters all appeared within his vision of death. For the man whose former greatness had vanished in a day, death seemed to remove the distinctions that life had built. The rich carried no gold into it. The oppressed heard no command within it. Those who had never reached the light were spared the trouble that now surrounded him. His questions then shifted from the moment of birth to the continuation of life. Why is light given to someone in misery? Why is life given to the bitter in soul? Job described people who waited for death, but it did not come. They searched for it more eagerly than someone digging for hidden treasure. The grave, which others feared, would make them rejoice. They would celebrate when they finally found it. His language revealed how far suffering had reversed the ordinary value of things. Light usually allowed life to continue. Hidden treasure promised wealth. For Job, continued light prolonged anguish, and the treasure worth finding was a grave. Then he brought the question fully upon himself. Why was light given to a man whose way was hidden, a man whom God had hedged in? The boundary that once surrounded Job's prosperity now felt like confinement. The accuser had spoken of a hedge protecting Job, his house, and all he possessed. Job had known that protection only through its results. Now, still unaware of the words exchanged about him, he described his path as concealed and himself as enclosed by God. He could not see where his suffering led. He could not identify an act that explained it. He had not heard the declaration that his destruction was without cause, and he had not heard the command that spared his life. From inside the permitted boundary, continued life itself had become part of the question. His sighing came in place of food. His groans poured out like water. The fear he feared had come upon him. What he dreaded had happened. Job had tried to guard the moral life of his family even during their days of feasting. He had risen early and offered sacrifices for each child because of what they could have done within their hearts. Yet the danger that reached his household had not followed an accusation against them. It had come through decisions entirely outside Job's knowledge. I have no ease, he said. I have no quiet. I have no rest. Trouble comes. The 7 days of silence had ended, but Job's lament did not resolve the mystery. It exposed it. A man identified by God as blameless and upright was asking why he had been allowed to live long enough to endure the death of his children, the destruction of his household, and pain throughout his body. Across from him sat 3 friends who had come to comfort him. They had heard every word, and now the silence demanded an answer. Eliphaz the Temanite answered first. He began carefully. If someone tried to speak to Job, would Job become impatient? Yet Eliphaz said he could not keep silent. He reminded Job of the man he had been before disaster reached him. Job had instructed many people. He had strengthened weak hands. His words had supported those who stumbled, and he had made feeble knees firm. When others suffered, Job knew how to steady them. Now suffering had come to Job, and he was impatient. It had touched him, and he was dismayed. Eliphaz turned Job's former conduct into the beginning of an argument. Should not Job's fear of God give him confidence? Should not the integrity of his ways give him hope? The question sounded encouraging, but the next question introduced a condition. Eliphaz asked Job to remember when an innocent person had ever perished. Where had the upright been destroyed? From Eliphaz's perspective, human outcomes revealed human conduct. He had seen people plow wickedness and sow trouble, and then harvest the same things. At the breath of God they perished. At the blast of his anger they were consumed. He compared their strength to that of lions. A lion could roar, and a fierce lion could raise its voice, but even the teeth of strong lions were broken. The lion perished when it had no prey, and its cubs were scattered. Job had described calamities that did not match his life. Eliphaz answered by insisting upon a pattern. Destruction followed evil as a harvest followed planting. He did not yet accuse Job of a particular act. He placed Job beneath a principle and allowed the principle to raise its own suspicion. Then Eliphaz described a frightening experience. A word had come to him secretly, like a whisper caught by his ear. It came during troubling thoughts in the night, when deep sleep falls upon people. Fear and trembling seized him and made his bones shake. A spirit passed before his face, and the hair of his body stood up. A form stopped in front of him, but he could not identify its appearance. There was silence, and then he heard a voice. Can a mortal be more righteous than God? Can a man be more pure than his Maker? The voice continued by measuring every created being against God. God did not place complete trust even in his servants, and he charged his angels with error. Human beings were far more fragile. They lived in houses of clay, with foundations in the dust. They could be crushed more easily than a moth. Between morning and evening, they could be broken to pieces and perish without anyone giving it lasting attention. The cord of their tent was pulled up, and they died without wisdom. The experience supported Eliphaz's warning. Job wanted his innocence taken seriously, but Eliphaz placed the question beneath a greater one. How could any mortal claim purity before the one who made him? Eliphaz then challenged Job to call out and see who would answer. Which of the holy ones would he turn to? Resentment killed a foolish man, and envy destroyed the simple. Eliphaz said he had personally seen a fool taking root, only to pronounce a curse upon that man's home. The fool's children were far from safety. They were crushed at the gate, and no one delivered them. The hungry consumed his harvest, taking it even from among thorns, while the thirsty swallowed his wealth. Job had just lost his children and the produce of his labor. Eliphaz's example drew close to those wounds. A ruined household, endangered children, and devoured wealth belonged, in his reasoning, to the fate of a fool. Affliction did not spring from the dust, Eliphaz said, and trouble did not grow from the ground. Human beings were born to trouble as surely as sparks flew upward. Yet Eliphaz's larger argument did not treat Job's particular calamity as random. The pattern he described still connected ruin to moral failure. Eliphaz told Job what he himself would do. He would seek God and place his case before him. God performed great and unsearchable things, wonders beyond counting. He gave rain to the earth and sent water upon the fields. He raised the lowly and lifted mourners into safety. He frustrated the schemes of the crafty so that their plans failed. He caught the wise in their own cleverness, and the counsel of the cunning collapsed around them. They met darkness in the daytime and groped at noon as though it were night. At the same time, God rescued the needy from powerful words and powerful hands. The poor received hope, and injustice was silenced. That vision of God's rule led Eliphaz to a conclusion about Job. The person God corrected was blessed. Job should not reject the discipline of the Almighty. God wounded, but he also bound the wound. He struck, but his hands healed. He would deliver a person from 6 troubles, and in 7 no evil would touch him. In famine he would preserve him from death, in war from the sword. He would hide him from the lash of the tongue. When destruction came, he would not need to fear. Such a person would be secure even among the stones of the field, and the wild animals would be at peace with him. He would know that his tent was safe. He would inspect his dwelling and find nothing missing. His descendants would be numerous, and his offspring would spread like grass. He would go to the grave in full maturity, like a bundle of grain gathered at the proper time. Eliphaz offered Job a path from devastation back to security, but that path required Job to accept the devastation as correction. The promise that he might inspect his home and find nothing missing fell upon a man whose 10 children were already dead. The promise of many descendants required him to receive his present loss as the discipline of God. Eliphaz ended with confidence. He and his companions had examined these things, and they were true. Job should hear them and apply them to himself. Job answered by asking for his grief to be weighed. If his anguish could be placed on one side of a scale and all his calamity on the other, together they would outweigh the sand of the seas. That was why his words had been reckless. Eliphaz had treated the force of Job's lament as a spiritual failure. Job answered that the force of the words matched the weight upon him. He described arrows from the Almighty lodged within him. His spirit was drinking their poison, and the terrors of God were arranged against him. An animal did not cry out without a reason. A wild donkey did not bray while it had grass, and an ox did not groan while standing over its food. Tasteless food required salt, and the white of an egg offered no flavor. Job found what had been set before him too repulsive to touch. His soul rejected it as loathsome food. His lament had not risen from comfort. Pain had produced the cry just as hunger or deprivation produced the cry of an animal. Eliphaz wanted Job to moderate his words. Job wanted Eliphaz to understand why those words existed. Then Job named the request he still wanted God to grant. He wanted God to crush him, to release his hand and cut him off. Death would give Job one remaining consolation. Even in unrelenting pain, he could rejoice that he had not denied the words of the Holy One. Job did not seek death as an opportunity to curse God. He sought an end while still holding to what he had refused to deny. He asked what strength he possessed that would allow him to keep waiting. What end remained that would justify prolonging his life? Was his strength the strength of stones? Was his flesh made of bronze? He had no help within himself. The ability to succeed had been driven away from him. That was where Job believed friendship should have entered. A despairing man deserved kindness from his friend, even as he stood in danger of forsaking the fear of the Almighty. Eliphaz had seen Job's misery and offered a doctrine that made misery evidence against him. Job needed faithful kindness. Instead, he found his companions unreliable. He compared them to seasonal streams. Water darkened them when ice and melting snow filled their channels. But under the heat, the water vanished. When the season became hot, the streams disappeared from their place. Caravans turned aside from their routes to find those waters. Travelers from Tema searched for them, and merchants from Sheba placed their hope in them. They were confident because the channels had once held water. But when they arrived, they were disappointed. Job told his friends that they had become like those streams. They saw something dreadful and were afraid. Their support disappeared at the moment he needed it. He had not asked them to bring him a gift from their wealth. He had not demanded payment from their resources. He had not asked them to rescue him from an enemy or redeem him from violent men. He asked them to show him where he was wrong. Teach me, and I will be silent. Help me understand my error. Honest words could be forceful, but what did their argument actually prove? Were they planning to correct mere words, treating the speech of a desperate man as wind? Their reasoning did more than fail to comfort. Job accused them of conduct that would betray the defenseless. They would cast lots over an orphan and bargain over a friend. He asked them to look at him. He would not lie to their faces. They should turn from their course and stop dealing unjustly with him. His righteousness remained at stake. They should reconsider because he had not spoken wickedness. His mouth could still recognize what was destructive. Job then turned from his friends to the condition of human life. Life on earth was hard service. Human days resembled the days of a hired worker. A servant longed for evening shade, and a laborer waited for his wages. Job had been allotted months of emptiness and nights of misery. When he lay down, he asked when he would rise. The night stretched on, and he tossed until dawn. His flesh was clothed with worms and clods of dirt. His skin hardened, then broke open again. His days moved faster than a weaver's shuttle and came to an end without hope. Job asked God to remember that his life was only a breath. His eye would not return to see good. The eye looking upon him would soon see him no more. God would look for him, and he would be gone. A cloud vanished and passed away. In the same way, Job said, the person who descended to the grave did not come back up. He did not return to his house, and his place knew him no longer. Because his life was disappearing, Job refused to restrain his mouth. He would speak from the anguish of his spirit and complain from the bitterness of his soul. He asked God why he had been placed under guard. Was he the sea or a great sea creature that required a watch over him? When Job thought his bed would comfort him and his couch would ease his complaint, dreams terrified him and visions frightened him. He would rather be strangled. He would choose death over the body in which he now suffered. He loathed his life. He did not want to live forever. He asked God to leave him alone because his days were only a breath. Then Job reshaped a question of human dignity into a question of divine scrutiny. What was a human being that God made so much of him, set his attention upon him, visited him every morning and tested him every moment? How long would God refuse to look away? Would he not leave Job alone long enough for him to swallow? Job even addressed the possibility Eliphaz had placed before him. If I have sinned, what have I done to you, watcher of humanity? He wanted the offense identified. Why had God made him a target? Why had he become a burden? And if iniquity truly explained his suffering, Job asked why God did not pardon the transgression and take away the guilt. Job would soon lie down in the dust. God would seek him, and he would be gone. Eliphaz had urged Job to accept correction and promised restoration. Job answered that correction required an identifiable wrong. Friendship required more than fear, and human strength had a limit. He had not denied God, but he would not call his grief meaningless or confess to an offense no one had shown him. His demand now stood plainly between the four men. If suffering proved guilt, then his friends needed to name that guilt. If they could not, they had to face the possibility that the anguish of an upright man did not fit the moral order they were defending. Bildad the Shuhite answered by rejecting that possibility. How long would Job speak this way? His words were a mighty wind. Bildad treated the intensity of Job's protest not as evidence of pain, but as force without substance. Then he asked two questions that defined his position. Does God pervert justice? Does the Almighty pervert what is right? For Bildad, the answer was settled. God did not distort justice. Therefore, the disasters within Job's family had to agree with justice, whether Job understood them or not. Bildad applied that reasoning directly to Job's children. If they had sinned against God, then God had delivered them into the power of their transgression. The wind that struck the oldest brother's house had killed all 10 children together. Bildad now connected their deaths to their own sin. Job had once offered sacrifices because they could have cursed God in their hearts. He had never accused them of doing so. Bildad treated their fate as the consequence of wrongdoing. But he offered Job a different outcome. If Job would earnestly seek God and plead with the Almighty, if he were pure and upright, then God would rouse himself on Job's behalf and restore Job to his rightful place. His former prosperity would seem small compared with what came afterward. The promise was conditional. Bildad did not tell Job that his claim of integrity was true. He told him what God would do if it were true. Restoration would function as proof, just as destruction had become proof against Job's children. To support this certainty, Bildad directed Job toward earlier generations. Job and his companions had been born only yesterday and knew little. Their days on earth passed like a shadow. The generations before them could teach what experience had established. Their words came from accumulated understanding rather than from one brief human life. Bildad drew his first example from plants that depend upon water. Papyrus could not grow where there was no marsh, and reeds could not flourish without water. Even while such a plant remained green and uncut, it withered more quickly than other grass when deprived of what sustained it. So it was with everyone who forgot God. The hope of the godless would perish. What he trusted was fragile, and his confidence was like a spider's web. He leaned upon his house, but it could not stand. He grasped it, but it could not hold. The image came close to Job's ruin once again. A house had fallen and the family inside had died. Bildad compared the security of a godless person to a structure incapable of remaining upright. He then described a vigorous plant spreading in the sun. Its shoots reached across a garden. Its roots wound around a pile of stones and held fast among the rocks. Yet when it was torn from its place, that place denied ever seeing it. Its flourishing ended, and other plants rose from the same soil. Prosperity, in Bildad's reasoning, did not prove lasting favor if the person enjoying it had abandoned God. A godless life could look green and deeply rooted before it was suddenly removed. Bildad concluded by returning to the distinction he considered unbreakable. God would not reject a blameless person, and he would not strengthen the hands of evildoers. If Job turned toward him rightly, God would fill Job's mouth with laughter and his lips with shouts of joy. Those who hated him would be clothed with shame, and the tent of the wicked would disappear. The implications were now sharper than Eliphaz's appeal to discipline. Bildad had placed Job between two categories. The blameless were not rejected. The wicked did not endure. Job had been rejected into suffering, so his insistence on innocence seemed to challenge the justice of God himself. Job answered that he knew the principle behind Bildad's argument. Yes, I know that this is true, but how can a mortal be right before God? His question did not concede that Bildad had explained his losses. It exposed the impossible position Job faced. If he tried to dispute with God, he could not answer one question in 1,000. God was wise in heart and mighty in strength. No one could harden himself against God and emerge unharmed. He moved mountains before they knew what had happened and overturned them in his anger. He shook the earth from its place, and its pillars trembled. He commanded the sun, and it did not rise. He sealed away the stars. God stretched out the heavens by himself and walked upon the waves of the sea. He made the Bear, Orion, the Pleiades, and the constellations of the southern sky. He performed great things beyond searching and wonders beyond counting. Job did not reduce God in order to defend himself. He described power so immense that no human being could place it under examination. That greatness was part of Job's problem. The judge he wanted to approach controlled the world in which any hearing would occur. God could pass beside Job without being seen. He could move by, and Job would not perceive him. If God seized something, who could make him give it back? Who could ask him, "What are you doing?" God did not withdraw his anger merely because someone resisted. Even the helpers of Rahab bowed beneath him, the powers associated with defiance brought down before his might. How then could Job answer God? What words could he choose? Even if Job were right, he could not simply present an argument. He would have to plead for mercy from his judge. And even if he called and God answered, Job said he would struggle to believe that God had listened to his voice. From where Job sat, God had crushed him with a storm and multiplied his wounds without cause. He would not allow Job to catch his breath, but filled him with bitterness. If the contest concerned strength, God was mighty. If it concerned justice, who could summon God to court? Job imagined the failure of every defense. If he declared himself right, his own mouth could condemn him. If he claimed to be blameless, his words could be turned into evidence of perversity. He maintained his integrity, yet suffering had made even his own life difficult to comprehend. He despised the life that remained to him. Then Job confronted the conclusion his experience forced upon him. It is all one. God destroyed both the blameless and the wicked. When a scourge brought sudden death, Job said, God mocked the despair of the innocent. The earth had been handed over to the wicked, and the faces of its judges were covered. If God was not responsible for the order under which this happened, Job asked, who was? These were the words of a man refusing Bildad's categories. Bildad had claimed that destruction marked the godless while restoration awaited the pure. Job looked at the world and at his own body and could not make that division hold. The same calamity could overtake people regardless of their conduct, while wicked hands could control the earth and blind its judges. Meanwhile, Job's life continued to race away. His days were faster than a runner. They fled without seeing good. They swept past like swift boats and like an eagle diving upon its prey. Job considered changing his expression. He could decide to forget his complaint, put away his sadness, and appear cheerful. But the thought did not free him. He remained afraid of everything he suffered because he believed God would not treat him as innocent. If he was already condemned, why should he exhaust himself trying to prove otherwise? He imagined washing himself with snow and cleansing his hands with strong soap. Even then, God could plunge him into a pit until his own clothes recoiled from him. Job could make himself as clean as human effort allowed, but he could not control how the judge treated that effort. The central obstacle was not merely Job's pain. God was not a man like Job, someone he could answer so that the two might come together in court. There was no arbiter between them, no one able to place a hand upon both and establish fair terms. Job wanted someone to remove God's rod from him and take away the terror that overwhelmed him. Then he could speak without fear. But as things stood, he could not. The hearing Job desired required equality of access, not equality of power. He needed a figure who could reach both sides, restrain fear, and let the dispute be heard. Without that mediator, the same God Job accused would also be the judge of the accusation. Job turned his words directly toward God. He loathed his life, so he would give free expression to his complaint. He would speak from the bitterness of his soul. He asked God not to condemn him without explanation. "Show me why you contend with me." Was it good for God to oppress, to reject the work of his own hands while favoring the purposes of the wicked? Did God see with human eyes? Were his days like the days of a mortal, so that he had to search hurriedly for Job's guilt and investigate some hidden sin? God already knew that Job was not guilty, Job said, and Job also knew that no one could deliver him from God's hand. That made the destruction deeply personal. God's own hands had shaped Job and made him, yet now those same hands had turned to destroy him. Job asked God to remember how he had been formed. God had fashioned him like clay. Would he now return that clay to dust? Job described the hidden work by which his body had come into being. God had poured him out like milk and curdled him like cheese. He had clothed him with skin and flesh and woven him together with bones and tendons. He had given Job life and steadfast love. God's care had preserved Job's spirit. The body now covered in sores was the body God had assembled. The life Job wanted to surrender was the life God had given and guarded. Job could not understand why such careful formation had led to such concentrated affliction, yet Job believed that God had concealed these present purposes in his heart. If Job sinned, God watched him and would not clear him of guilt. If he were wicked, misery awaited him. But even if he were righteous, Job could not lift his head. He was filled with disgrace and conscious of his affliction. If Job raised himself, God hunted him like a lion and displayed awesome power against him. God renewed his witnesses against Job and increased his indignation. Wave after wave came against him like troops replacing one another. The language matched Job's experience of the messengers. Before one report ended, another arrived. Now Job felt that his suffering itself served as a succession of witnesses, each new wound testifying against the innocence he continued to claim. He returned to the question with which his lament had begun. Why had God brought him out of the womb? If Job had died before any eye saw him, he would have been as though he had never existed. He would have been carried from the womb to the grave. His remaining days were few. He asked God to stop and leave him alone, long enough to find a little relief before he went to the place from which he would not return, a land of darkness and deep shadow, a place of gloom and disorder, where even light was like darkness. Bildad had promised light, laughter, security, and restoration if Job proved pure. Job could not reach that promise by simply repeating the confession Bildad expected. He wanted the charge against him identified, the judge made accessible, and the terror removed long enough for him to speak freely. But the judge had not appeared. The arbiter Job needed did not stand between them. His questions remained directed toward a God whose power he fully acknowledged and whose treatment of him he could not reconcile with his innocence. Job had refused to surrender either side of the conflict. God was mighty and governed all things. Job had not committed the evil that his ruin seemed to announce. Holding both claims together left him with a demand for a hearing and with another friend ready to answer in place of the God he sought. Zophar the Naamathite had reached the end of his patience. Should so many words go unanswered? Should a man be proved right simply because he talked at length? Job's claims, Zophar said, had silenced the others, but that did not mean no one should shame him. Zophar summarized Job's position as a claim that his teaching was pure and that he was clean in God's sight. He wanted God to speak, but not for the reason Job did. Job wanted the charge against him revealed. Zophar wanted God to reveal the hidden dimensions of wisdom and show Job how wrong he was. True wisdom had more than one side. If God disclosed its secrets, Job would discover that God was demanding less of him than his guilt deserved. With that assertion, Zophar moved beyond Eliphaz and Bildad. Eliphaz had described suffering as a harvest and then as discipline. Bildad had tied the deaths of Job's children to their transgression. Zophar now declared that Job's punishment was lighter than it should have been. He asked whether Job could discover the depths of God or reach the limits of the Almighty. They were higher than heaven. What could Job do? They were deeper than the grave. What could he know? Their measure was longer than the earth and broader than the sea. If God passed through, imprisoned someone, and called a court intercession, who could stop him? God recognized worthless people. He saw wickedness even when others did not consider it. Zophar used the very greatness Job had described against him. Job had said God could not be summoned to court. Zophar agreed with the imbalance of power, then treated that imbalance as a reason for Job to abandon his defense. God's wisdom was inaccessible. God saw hidden evil, and Job stood beneath his judgment. An empty-headed man could no more become wise, Zophar said, than a wild donkey could be born human. Still, Zophar offered conditions for a better future. If Job prepared his heart and stretched out his hands toward God, if he removed the iniquity within his hand and refused to let injustice live in his tents, then he would be able to lift his face without shame. He would stand firm and feel no fear. Job would forget his misery. He would remember it only as water that had flowed past. His life would become brighter than midday, and its darkness would become like morning. Hope would make him secure. He would look around and rest in safety. He would lie down with no one to frighten him, and many people would seek his favor. But the eyes of the wicked would fail. Their way of escape would disappear, and their only hope would be to breathe their last. Zophar's promise rested upon an accusation expressed as a condition. Job needed to remove wickedness from his hand and injustice from his tents. The man who had asked to be shown his offense was again told to repent without being shown what he had done. Job looked at the three men and answered them together. Without doubt, you are the people, and wisdom will die with you. He had understanding as well. He was not inferior to them. The principles they kept repeating were common knowledge. Job had become a laughingstock to his friends, even though he was a man who had called upon God and received an answer. A righteous and blameless man had become an object of ridicule. People at ease held contempt for misfortune, Job said. They regarded it as something waiting for those whose feet were already slipping. Yet the tents of robbers remained undisturbed. Those who provoked God lived securely, carrying their power in their own hands. The neat division between secure righteousness and ruined wickedness still did not match what Job saw. His friends promised safety as the reward of purity, but violent people could possess safety while an upright man sat in ashes. Job invited the three men to learn from the world around them. Ask the animals, and they would teach. Ask the birds of the sky, and they would tell. Speak to the earth, and it would instruct. Let the fish of the sea explain. Every creature knew that the hand of the Lord had done this. The life of every living thing and the breath of all humanity rested in his hand. Job was not disputing that God governed life. He insisted upon it. His friends had spoken as though he failed to recognize divine power, but Job's entire complaint depended upon that power. If events lay outside God's rule, then Job's demand for an answer from God would make no sense. The ear tested words as the palate tasted food. Age carried wisdom, and length of days brought understanding. But complete wisdom and power belonged to God. Counsel and understanding were his. When God tore something down, it could not be rebuilt. When he shut someone in, that person could not be released. If God held back the waters, the land dried up. If he sent them out, they overturned the earth. Strength and sound judgment belonged to him. The deceived and the deceiver were both under his power. He led counselors away, stripped of their status, and made fools of judges. He removed the bonds imposed by kings and placed a restraint upon the kings themselves. He led priests away and overthrew established powers. God silenced trusted advisors and removed the discernment of elders. He poured contempt upon princes and loosened the strength of the mighty. He uncovered deep things hidden in darkness and brought the shadow of death into light. He made nations great and then destroyed them. He enlarged nations and led them away. He removed understanding from their leaders and made them wander through a wasteland without a path. They groped in darkness with no light and staggered like drunken men. This was not the predictable arrangement Job's friends had described. God's power could build or dismantle, reveal or confuse, release or imprison. Counselors, judges, kings, priests, elders, princes, mighty men, nations and their leaders all remained vulnerable to reversals imposed by a wisdom beyond them. Job had seen such a reversal in his own life. The greatest man in the East had become a laughingstock to his friends. That did not prove that God lacked control. It proved that human status could not explain what God was doing. Everything Job's eye had seen and his ear had heard, he understood. He was not inferior to his companions, but he no longer wanted to debate only with them. I would speak to the Almighty. I desire to argue my case with God. The three friends had not healed anything. Job called them smearers of lies and worthless physicians. If they would remain completely silent, their silence would count as wisdom. He asked them to listen to his argument. Would they speak unjustly on God's behalf? Would they use deceit in order to defend him? Would they show God partiality and act as his advocates? Job challenged the role they had assumed. They believed they were defending divine justice, but a defense built upon unsupported accusations was still false. God's greatness did not need them to misrepresent Job. What would happen if God examined them? Could they deceive him as one person deceived another? God would surely rebuke them if they secretly showed partiality. His majesty would terrify them, and the dread of him would fall upon them. Their memorable sayings were proverbs of ashes. Their defenses were defenses of clay. Job told them to be silent and let him speak, whatever the consequence. He was willing to place himself in danger and take his life into his own hands. Even at the risk of death, he would defend his conduct before God. That willingness itself gave Job hope of deliverance. A godless man would not dare appear before God, but Job was asking to be heard. He told the friends to listen carefully. He had prepared his case, and he knew he would be vindicated. If someone could successfully contend with him, Job would fall silent and die. Then he addressed God and requested two conditions. Withdraw your hand from me and do not let your terror frighten me. If those conditions were granted, God could call and Job would answer, or Job could speak and God could respond. The request returned to the arbiter Job had wanted. He was not asking for God to surrender authority. He was asking for the suffering and terror to be restrained so that an exchange could occur. Job wanted to know the number of his sins and offenses. He asked God to reveal his transgression. Why did God hide his face and treat Job as an enemy? Was God frightening a wind-blown leaf and pursuing dry chaff? Job compared the force directed against him with the weakness of its target. God possessed wisdom and power beyond measure. Job was as fragile as a leaf or chaff. Yet God wrote bitter charges against him and made him inherit the offenses of his youth. God put Job's feet in stocks, watched all his paths, and marked the soles of his feet. Meanwhile, Job wasted away like something rotten, like a garment consumed by moths. That thought carried him from his own decay into the condition shared by every human being. A man born of woman lived only a few days, and those days were full of trouble. He came up like a flower and withered. He fled like a shadow and did not remain. Would God really fix his attention upon such a creature and bring him into judgment? Who could produce something clean from what was unclean? Human life had determined days. The number of a person's months rested with God, and God had set a limit that could not be crossed. Job asked God to look away and let the laborer finish his day. A hired worker expected the end of his labor. Job wanted the same release. Then he looked at a tree. A tree had hope. If it was cut down, it could sprout again. New shoots could appear, its root could grow old in the earth, and its stump could die in the soil. Yet at the scent of water, it could bud and send out branches like a young plant. A human being did not appear to possess that same renewal. A man died and lay powerless. He breathed his last, and where was he? Water disappeared from a lake, and a riverbed became parched and dry. In the same way, a person lay down and did not rise. Until the heavens passed away, the dead did not wake or rise from sleep. The difference tormented Job. A felled tree could respond when water returned. A dead man did not rise within the world, Job knew. He wished God would hide him in the grave, conceal him until divine anger had passed, set an appointed time, and then remember him. If a man dies, will he live again? Job did not present the question as an answer. He imagined what such an answer would mean. He would wait through all the days of his hard service until his renewal came. God would call, and Job would answer. God would long for the work of his own hands. That possibility reversed Job's present condition. Instead of hunting and confining him, God would desire the human being he had formed. He would count Job's steps without watching for sin. Job's transgression would be sealed in a bag, and his iniquity covered. But Job's present vision returned to erosion. A mountain fell and crumbled. A rock was moved from its place. Water wore away stones, and floods washed away the soil. In the same way, Job told God, "You destroy human hope." God overpowered a person permanently and sent him away. He changed the man's face and dismissed him. If the man's sons received honor, he did not know it. If they were brought low, he did not perceive it. He felt the pain of his own body and mourned for himself. Job's appeal had now moved beyond the three men sitting with him. He had challenged their wisdom, rejected their accusations, and demanded direct engagement with God. Yet his demand ended with a question rather than a hearing. Could the God who formed a human life remember that life beyond death, call it back, and desire it again? Job wanted that possibility, but the world before him displayed decay, separation, and hope worn down like stone beneath water. The three friends had heard him refuse their conditions. He would not accept that disaster proved guilt. He would not confess to hidden oppression simply to gain the restoration they promised. And he would not let them defend God with accusations they could not establish. To Job, that was integrity. To the men across from him, it was beginning to sound like defiance. Eliphaz answered with open accusation. Would a wise man reply with empty knowledge, or fill himself with the hot east wind? Would he argue with useless words and speeches that accomplished nothing? Eliphaz believed Job's words were not merely mistaken, they were dangerous. Job was undermining the fear of God and weakening devotion before him. His own iniquity was teaching his mouth, and he had chosen the language of the crafty. Job did not need another witness to condemn him, Eliphaz said. His own mouth did it. His own lips testified against him. Then Eliphaz challenged the authority with which Job had dismissed the friends. Was Job the first man ever born? Had he come into existence before the hills? Had he listened within the counsel of God and kept wisdom for himself? What did Job know that the others did not? What understanding did he possess that was unavailable to them? Gray-haired and aged men stood among their people, men older than Job's father. Job had appealed to the limits of human wisdom. Eliphaz appealed to age and tradition, then asked why Job treated the consolations of God as too small and rejected words spoken gently to him. Why had Job's heart carried him away? Why did his eyes flash as he turned his spirit against God and released such words from his mouth? Eliphaz repeated the question from his earlier vision. How could a human being be pure? How could someone born of woman be righteous? God placed no trust even in his holy ones, and the heavens were not pure in his sight. How much less a person who was corrupt and detestable, someone who drank injustice like water. The description moved from humanity in general toward Job. Eliphaz had begun by saying Job's own words condemned him. Now he placed before him the portrait of a man saturated with injustice. He told Job to listen while he explained what he had seen and what wise men had received from their fathers without concealing it. The land had been given to those men, and no stranger had passed among them to disrupt what they handed down. Their conclusion concerned the wicked. A wicked man suffered torment throughout his days, and a ruthless man lived through years appointed for terror. Frightening sounds filled his ears. Even during prosperity, a destroyer came upon him. He did not expect to return from darkness. A sword waited for him. He wandered in search of food, asking where it could be found, because he knew that a day of darkness was ready at hand. Distress and anguish terrified him. They overpowered him like a king prepared for battle. Eliphaz then explained why this man suffered. He had stretched out his hand against God and defied the Almighty. He had charged at God stubbornly, protected by a thick shield. His prosperity had changed his body. His face was covered with fat, and heaviness gathered around his waist. Yet he came to inhabit ruined cities and deserted houses, buildings ready to collapse. He would not remain rich, his wealth would not endure, and his possessions would not spread through the land. He would not escape darkness. Fire would wither his shoots, and the breath of God's mouth would carry him away. He should not trust in worthlessness or deceive himself, because worthlessness would be his reward. His branch would fail to remain green. Like a vine shaking off unripe grapes and an olive tree dropping its blossoms, his life would lose its fruit before the proper time. The company of the godless was barren. Fire consumed the tents of those who accepted bribes. They conceived trouble, gave birth to evil, and their womb prepared deceit. Eliphaz never named Job within that portrait, but its details surrounded him. A destroyer arriving during prosperity, darkness, the loss of wealth, fire, ruined houses, withered offspring, and a desolate tent, all echoed what Job had endured. Eliphaz had moved beyond urging him to accept discipline. He was identifying Job's experience with the recognized fate of a defiant and unjust man. Job answered that he had heard many things like these. Miserable comforters are you all. Would their windy words never end? What provoked Eliphaz to continue answering this way? Job could also speak if their positions were exchanged. If the three friends were suffering and he sat where they sat, he could compose speeches against them and shake his head. But he could also strengthen them with his mouth. The movement of his lips could bring relief. The difference lay in what words did to the sufferer. Eliphaz's words transformed pain into evidence of corruption. Job said words could instead support the person carrying it. Yet neither speaking nor silence relieved Job's own grief. If he spoke, his pain did not leave. If he remained quiet, it did not go away. Job turned again toward God. God had worn him out and devastated his entire company. God had shriveled him, and that condition had become a witness. His gauntness rose up and testified against him. The body wasting before the friends appeared to confirm their judgment. They saw suffering and read guilt upon it. Job saw the same body and accused God of making his misery testify falsely. He described God tearing him in wrath and treating him with hostility. God gnashed his teeth against him, and his adversary sharpened his eyes upon him. Around Job, people opened their mouths. They struck his cheek in mockery and gathered together against him. Job said God had handed him over to the ungodly and thrown him into the hands of the wicked. He had once been at ease, but God shattered him. God seized him by the neck, dashed him to pieces, and set him up as a target. Archers surrounded him. Their arrows split open his kidneys without mercy and poured his gall upon the ground. God broke through him again and again, then rushed upon him like a warrior. The language turned his suffering into an assault. Job was the target, and the power attacking him never missed. The successive blows that had reached his household now became breaches opened through Job himself. He had sewn sackcloth over his skin and buried his strength in the dust. His face was red from weeping, and deep darkness lay beneath his eyelids. Still, Job denied the conclusion Eliphaz drew from his condition. This had happened though no violence was in his hands, and his prayer was pure. He called upon the earth not to cover his blood. Let his cry find no resting place. Uncovered blood continued to demand an answer. Job did not want his suffering buried with the accusations unresolved. His cry needed to remain present until someone answered it. Then he located the witness his friends had refused to become. Even now, my witness is in heaven. My advocate is on high. His friends mocked him while his eyes poured out tears to God. He longed for someone to plead with God on behalf of a man, as one person pleads for a friend. Job had asked for an arbiter who could place a hand upon both him and God. Now he spoke of a witness in heaven and an advocate above. He did not identify that figure further. He described the role he needed, someone who knew his case and could carry it where Job himself could not. The need was urgent, because only a few years remained before Job would travel the path from which he would not return. His spirit was broken. His days were extinguished. The grave was ready for him. Mockers surrounded him, and his eyes had to endure their provocation. So Job asked God himself to provide the pledge required for his case. Who else would give security for him? God had closed the friends' hearts to understanding, Job said, and therefore would not exalt them. A person who denounced friends for a share brought consequences upon his own children. Job had become a byword among the people. He had become someone in whose face people spat. His eyes had grown dim with grief, and his entire body was like a shadow. The upright were appalled at this, and the innocent stirred themselves against the godless. Yet the righteous person held to his way, and the one with clean hands grew stronger. Job invited the friends to return and try again, but he did not expect to find a wise man among them. His days had passed. His plans were shattered, along with the desires of his heart. The friends turned night into day and claimed that light was near even when darkness surrounded him. Their promises of restoration declared brightness close at hand, but Job saw his remaining destination in the grave. If he made the grave his home and spread his bed in darkness, if he called corruption his father and the worm his mother or sister, where was his hope? Who could see any hope for him? Would it descend with him to the bars of the grave? Would hope and Job go down together into the dust? Eliphaz had described the darkness awaiting a wicked man. Job already expected darkness, but he refused to let Eliphaz decide what it meant. Death did not prove that Job had defied God. Suffering did not reveal violence in his hands. A ruined body could appear as a witness against him, while his true witness remained in heaven. That appeal marked how far the friendship had deteriorated. The men who came to mourn and comfort Job now used his wounds as evidence in a case against him. Job no longer asked them to represent his grief fairly. He appealed over their heads to an advocate on high. But the advocate had not yet spoken. Job's blood still cried for an answer. His plans lay broken, and the men beside him were becoming more certain that his refusal to confess was itself the proof they needed. Bildad answered by asking how long Job would continue speaking. Job should gain understanding, and then they could talk. Why did he regard the three friends as animals? Why did he consider them stupid? Bildad accused Job of tearing himself apart in anger. Should the earth be abandoned for Job's sake? Should a rock be moved from its place to accommodate him? The questions revealed what Bildad believed Job was demanding. If Job's innocence could coexist with his destruction, then the fixed order Bildad defended would have to move. Bildad refused to move it. Instead, he gave Job a long and terrifying portrait of the wicked man's end. The light of the wicked was extinguished. The flame of his fire stopped shining. Light within his tent became darkness, and the lamp above him went out. The steps that had once been strong grew short. The man's own plans threw him down. His feet carried him into a net, and he walked onto its mesh. A trap seized his heel. A snare held him fast. A rope lay hidden on the ground, and another trap waited along his path. Every direction offered capture. Terror frightened him on all sides and pursued him at his heels. His strength was consumed by hunger, and calamity stood ready when he stumbled. Then destruction reached his body. Disease devoured his skin. The firstborn of death consumed his limbs. The man was torn away from the security of his tent and marched before the king of terrors. His home did not survive him. Fire occupied his tent, and sulfur was scattered over his dwelling. His roots dried beneath the ground, and his branches withered above it. Bildad's image joined the death of a person to the destruction of his entire place in the world. The man's body failed. His tent became uninhabitable. His family line ended. Even his name disappeared. The memory of him perished from the earth. He had no name in the street. He was driven from light into darkness and expelled from the inhabited world. He left no offspring among his people, no descendant to continue his line, and no survivor where he had lived. People in the West were appalled by his fate, and people in the East were seized with horror. They looked upon his ruined place and recognized the dwelling of an unjust man, the home of someone who did not know God. Bildad never attached Job's name to the description. He did not need to. The parallels stood in front of them. Job's lamp had gone dark. Disease covered his skin. Terror had overtaken his life. Fire had consumed part of his estate. His children had died, leaving him without offspring. The security of his household had been torn away. The greatest man in the East now faced the possible extinction of his name. Eliphaz had used similar details to identify Job with the wicked. Bildad sharpened them into a complete erasure. The wicked man lost light, health, home, family, memory, and place. Job had already lost almost every one of those things. Job answered with a question of his own. How long will you torment me and crush me with words? The friends had reproached him repeatedly. Job counted 10 times that they had humiliated him. Even if he had truly gone astray, he said, his error remained his own concern. But the friends kept magnifying themselves against him. They used Job's disgrace as proof that they were right. Job told them to recognize what he believed had happened. God had wronged him and drawn a net around him. Bildad had described the wicked man walking into a net through his own schemes. Job rejected that explanation. The net around him did not come from a criminal plan turning back upon its maker. Job attributed it to God. He cried out that he had suffered violence, but he received no answer. He called for help, but justice did not come. God had walled up Job's road so that he could not pass. Darkness covered his paths. God had stripped him of his glory and removed the crown from his head. The reversal was complete. Job had once been the greatest man in the East. Now every visible mark of that standing had been taken. God broke him down on every side, and Job was gone. His hope was uprooted like a tree. Bildad had described the wicked man as a tree whose roots dried below and whose branches withered above. Job again accepted the image, but rejected the accusation attached to it. His hope had indeed been uprooted, yet Job said God had done the uprooting. God's anger burned against him and counted him among his enemies. His troops advanced together, built a siege ramp against him, and camped around his tent. Job no longer described isolated blows. He pictured himself as a besieged man whose roads had been closed and whose defenses had been surrounded by forces under God's command. Then he named the human losses that followed. God had put Job's brothers far from him. His acquaintances had become estranged. His relatives had failed him, and his close friends had forgotten him. Guests in his house and his female servants regarded him as a stranger. He had become a foreigner in their sight. When Job called his servant, the man did not answer. Job had to plead with his own mouth. His breath was offensive to his wife. He was loathsome to his own brothers. Even young children despised him. When he rose, they spoke against him. His intimate friends detested him. The people he loved had turned against him. The three men sitting with Job were part of a wider collapse in relationship and standing. Job had lost more than the animals and servants killed on the day of disaster. The survivors and acquaintances who remained did not relate to him as they once had. Authority, affection, familiarity, and respect had all been reversed. His physical condition matched his social ruin. His bones clung to his skin and flesh. He had escaped only by the skin of his teeth. Job turned from describing those who rejected him to pleading with the friends still sitting before him. Have pity on me, my friends, for the hand of God has touched me. Why did they persecute him as God did? Why were they not satisfied with the suffering already consuming his body? Job did not ask them to solve the mystery in that moment. He asked for pity. God's hand had struck him. His flesh had been reduced. The friends did not need to add their accusations to the devastation. Then Job's focus shifted from the words spoken against him to the words he wanted preserved. He wished his words could be written down. He wanted them inscribed in a book. Better still, he wanted an iron stylus to cut them into rock and lead to fill the letters, preserving them permanently. Bildad had threatened the extinction of the wicked man's memory and name. Job answered by demanding a testimony that could outlast his dying body. If his friends continued to treat his ruin as proof of guilt, then his own declaration needed to remain after he could no longer speak it. What Job wanted preserved was not only his complaint. At the center of his appeal stood a conviction. I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the end he will stand upon the earth. A Redeemer was a living vindicator, someone able to take up the cause of a person whose rights had been lost or denied. Job had asked for an arbiter between himself and God. He had spoken of a witness in heaven and an advocate on high. Now he said his Redeemer was alive and would stand. Job's human friends had become accusers. His relatives had failed. His close companions had forgotten him. Those he loved had turned against him. Yet the vindicator upon whom his case ultimately depended still lived. Job extended that conviction beyond the destruction of his skin. After his skin had been destroyed, he expected to see God. He himself would see him. His own eyes would look upon him, not the eyes of a stranger. The thought overwhelmed him from within. Job had just described death as the place toward which he was moving. Bildad had described the wicked as driven out of the world and erased from memory. Against that threat, Job expected a personal encounter. His body could be destroyed and his name condemned by others, but Job's case would not end with their verdict. The Redeemer would stand. Job would see God for himself. The testimony he wanted carved into rock would be vindicated by a living defender. He did not explain how his ruined body and that encounter fit together. He declared what he knew and whom he expected to see. The confidence did not resolve his pain, but it moved his hope beyond the approval of the three friends. Then Job warned them. They might continue asking how they could pursue him, claiming that the root of the problem lay within Job himself, but they should fear the sword. Wrath brought punishment by the sword, and they needed to know that judgment existed. The warning reversed their positions. The friends had spoken as if Job alone stood under judgment, and they merely announced it. Job told them that the way they persecuted him also placed them beneath judgment. Bildad had threatened a man with extinction. No light, no home, no descendants, no name, no survivor, and no memory. Job stood closer to that condition than Bildad did. Yet Job refused to let destruction define his moral identity. His body bore disease, but he still claimed innocence. His social world had abandoned him, but he still asked for pity. His children were gone, but he still demanded that his words endure. His friends treated him as a man who did not know God, but Job expected to see God with his own eyes. The dispute had now moved beyond differing explanations of suffering. Bildad's moral order required Job's ruin to reveal wickedness. Job's integrity required that ruin to be judged by someone other than the men using it against him. That was why the Redeemer mattered. Job no longer expected vindication to come through Eliphaz, Bildad, or Zophar. His hope rested in a living figure who would stand after human accusations had spent their force. But Job's warning left the friends with a choice. They could hear his plea for pity and reconsider the certainty with which they condemned him, or they could defend that certainty by insisting once more that wicked prosperity always collapses under judgment. Zophar chose the second course. His thoughts compelled him to answer quickly because of the agitation within him. He had heard Job's rebuke, which dishonored him, and his understanding supplied a response. Job had warned the friends to fear judgment. Zophar answered by returning that warning to Job. Had Job not known the pattern established from ancient times, from the moment humanity was placed upon the earth, the triumph of the wicked was brief, and the joy of the godless lasted only a moment. A wicked man could rise until his height reached the heavens and his head touched the clouds. Then he would perish permanently, discarded like his own refuse. Those who had seen him would ask where he had gone. He disappeared, like a dream that could not be found. He was chased away like a vision of the night. The eye that once saw him no more, and his place no longer looked upon him. His children sought the favor of the poor, and his own hands returned the wealth he had taken. His bones could be full of youthful strength, but that strength would lie down with him in the dust. Zophar described wickedness as something sweet in the mouth. The man hid it beneath his tongue. He was reluctant to release it and held it there, savoring it. But once swallowed, the food changed within him. It became the venom of cobras. The wealth he swallowed had to come back out. God forced it from his stomach. The man sucked the poison of serpents, and a viper's tongue killed him. He never enjoyed the streams and rivers flowing with honey and cream. He had to return the product of his labor without consuming it. He received no enjoyment from the profit of his trade. Zophar then named the conduct behind this reversal. The wicked man had crushed and abandoned the poor. He had seized a house he had not built. His appetite knew no rest. Nothing he desired escaped his greed, but because he devoured everything, his prosperity could not endure. In the fullness of his abundance, distress overtook him. Every hand of misery came against him. While he was filling his belly, God sent burning anger upon him and rained it down as his food. If the man fled from an iron weapon, a bronze bow pierced him. He pulled the arrow from his body, its gleaming point emerging from his liver. Terrors came upon him. Complete darkness waited for his treasures. A fire not kindled by human hands consumed him and destroyed whatever survived within his tent. The heavens revealed his guilt, and the earth rose against him. The possessions of his house were carried away like floodwater on the day of God's wrath. Zophar ended by declaring that this was the wicked man's portion from God, the inheritance God had appointed for him. The speech expanded Bildad's threat of extinction by supplying a crime. The ruined man had gained wealth through restless appetite, crushed the poor, and seized a house. His apparent success rose high, but it lasted only a moment before his body, possessions, children, tent, and memory fell beneath judgment. Once again, the pattern resembled Job's condition. His prosperity had vanished. His body was failing. His children were dead. Fire had struck his estate. The possessions of his household had been carried away, but Zophar still had not shown that Job had crushed the poor or taken another person's house. He had constructed a complete moral explanation for ruin, then placed that explanation beside the ruined man. Job asked the three friends to listen carefully. If they truly did, that attention itself would become their consolation to him. They should bear with him while he spoke. Afterward, they could continue mocking. Job's complaint was not directed against a human being. If it were, he asked, why should he not be impatient? He told them to look at him and be appalled. They should place a hand over their mouths. When Job remembered what he had seen, terror seized him, and his body trembled. Then he asked the question their doctrine had failed to answer. Why do the wicked live? They did not merely remain alive for a brief moment. They reached old age and grew mighty in power. Their children were established around them, and they watched their descendants continue before their eyes. Their houses remained safe and free from fear. The rod of God did not fall upon them. Their bull bred successfully. Their cow gave birth without losing its calf. They sent out their children like a flock, and the children danced. They sang with tambourine and lyre and rejoiced to the sound of the pipe. They spent their days in prosperity and went down to the grave in peace. This was the reverse of the sequence Zophar had declared universal. Zophar's wicked man rose briefly, lost his wealth, watched his children suffer, and died in terror. Job pointed to wicked people whose wealth remained, whose animals reproduced, whose children flourished, and whose deaths were peaceful. Their prosperity did not lead them to seek God. They told God to depart from them. They had no desire to know his ways. Who is the Almighty that we should serve him? What would we gain by praying to him? The challenge made their condition more difficult for Job's friends to explain. These were not righteous people mistakenly included among the wicked. They rejected God openly, yet they lived long enough to see their descendants and enjoy their prosperity. Job did not attribute that prosperity to their own control. Their welfare was not held securely in their own hands. He wanted nothing to do with the counsel of the wicked. He was not admiring their rejection of God. He was confronting the fact that rejection did not always produce the immediate ruin his friends promised. How often was the lamp of the wicked actually extinguished? How often did calamity come upon them? How often did God distribute suffering to them in his anger? Were they always like straw before the wind, or chaff swept away by a storm? The friends could answer that God stored punishment for the wicked man's children. Job rejected that as an adequate response. Let God repay the man himself so that he would know it. Let his own eyes see his destruction. Let him drink from the wrath of the Almighty. What concern would a dead man have for the household that came after him once the number of his own months had ended? Job's own children had died while he remained alive. Bildad had suggested that their transgression explained their deaths. Now Job challenged the justice of delaying a wicked man's punishment until it reached the next generation. If retribution was meant to reveal guilt to the offender needed to experience and recognize it. But Job also knew he could not make God conform to that demand. Could anyone teach knowledge to God? The one who judged even those in the highest places. Job then placed two deaths beside each other. One person died in full strength, entirely secure and at ease. His body was well nourished, and his bones were rich with marrow. Another person died in bitterness of soul, never having tasted prosperity. They lay down alike in the dust, and worms covered them both. The same end received people whose lives had been radically different. Prosperity did not prove innocence, and bitterness did not prove wickedness. Death itself did not explain the moral condition of the person who died. Job told the friends that he knew their thoughts and the schemes by which they intended to wrong him. They asked where the house of the powerful man had gone. Where was the tent in which the wicked once lived? The vanished house and tent were meant to point toward Job. His household had been destroyed, so they treated the destruction as the answer to their own question. Job told them to ask travelers and consider the testimony they brought. The wicked were often spared in the day of calamity. They were delivered from the day of wrath. Who confronted such a man to his face and declared his conduct? Who repaid him for what he had done? When he died, he was carried to the grave, and watch was kept over his tomb. The soil of the valley was sweet to him. Countless people followed after him, just as innumerable people had gone before. Job's answer reached beyond a peaceful death. A wicked man could receive an attended burial rather than the disgrace Zophar described. He could pass through life without open confrontation, escape calamity, and join the countless dead without his fate, displaying the moral lesson the friends expected. Job ended by asking how their words could comfort him when their answers were empty. Their replies contained no faithfulness to the realities he had placed before them. The three friends kept describing a single pattern. Wickedness produced brief prosperity, then terror, lost children, destroyed wealth, physical collapse, and death. Job had now confronted them with a wider field of human outcomes. Some wicked people did collapse. Others lived securely, became powerful, watched their descendants, enjoyed music and prosperity, rejected God, and died in peace. Some sufferers died bitter without ever tasting good. Both kinds of people entered the dust. That evidence did not tell Job why his own disasters had occurred. It did something more immediate. It broke the friend's claim that disaster itself proved what kind of man he was. If the wicked did not always suffer as Zophar described, then Job's suffering could not establish that Job was wicked. His ruined house was not a confession. His dead children were not a verdict. His diseased body was not a reliable witness against his conduct. The friends could no longer answer him merely by repeating what always happened to evil people, because Job had shown that it did not always happen. To preserve their judgment against him, they would have to move from general patterns to Job himself. They would have to stop implying that his ruin resembled the fate of an oppressor and begin alleging the oppression directly. Eliphaz now supplied the accusations. He began by reducing the value of Job's integrity before God. Could a human being benefit God? A wise person benefited himself, but did Job's righteousness give pleasure to the Almighty? Did God gain anything because Job claimed that his ways were blameless? God was not rebuking Job because of his reverence, Eliphaz said. That was not why God had brought him into judgment. The reason was the opposite. Is not your wickedness great? Is there no end to your iniquities? Until this point, Eliphaz had described the kind of man whose life ended in ruin. Now he addressed Job directly and named particular offenses. Job had taken pledges from his brothers without cause. He had stripped people of their clothing and left them naked. He had refused water to the weary and withheld bread from the hungry. The land belonged to the powerful man, Eliphaz said, and the favored man lived upon it. Job had sent widows away empty-handed and crushed the arms of fatherless children. That was why snares surrounded him. That was why sudden terror overwhelmed him. Darkness kept him from seeing, and floodwaters covered him. The allegation was comprehensive. Job had used wealth and power against the vulnerable. He had taken security from people who owed him, refused necessities to the hungry and exhausted, favored the powerful, dismissed widows, and injured orphans. His present entrapment was the return of what he had done to others. Eliphaz then joined those acts to a view he attributed to Job. God lived in the height of heaven. The highest stars remained far below him. Yet Job said, according to Eliphaz, "What does God know? Can he judge through deep darkness?" Thick clouds concealed the earth from God's sight, and God walked upon the vault of heaven. Eliphaz had earlier accused Job of turning his spirit against God. Now he portrayed Job as someone who believed his conduct could escape divine observation. The charge explained both Job's alleged oppression and his refusal to confess. He had behaved as though God could not see through the clouds. Eliphaz asked whether Job intended to keep following the ancient path walked by wicked men. They had been seized before their time, and their foundations had been swept away by a river. They told God to leave them alone and asked what the Almighty could do to them, even though God had filled their houses with good things. Eliphaz rejected their counsel. He said the righteous saw the destruction of such people and rejoiced. The innocent mocked them because their adversaries had been cut down and fire had consumed what remained. Again, Job's calamities stood beneath the language. The foundations of wicked people were swept away. Fire consumed their possessions. They had once enjoyed good things but told God to depart. Then Eliphaz offered Job a way back. Become reconciled with God and be at peace. Good would come to him. He should receive instruction from God's mouth and place God's words within his heart. If Job returned to the Almighty, he would be restored. But he had to remove injustice from his tent. Eliphaz told him to throw his gold into the dust and his gold from Ophir among the stones of a stream. Then the Almighty would become Job's gold and his precious silver. Job would delight in God and lift his face toward him. He would pray and God would hear. Job would fulfill his vows. He would decide a matter and it would be established for him. Light would shine upon his paths. When others were brought low, Job would call for them to be lifted, and God would save the humble. God would even deliver someone who was not innocent through the cleanness of Job's hands. The offer contained a striking reversal. Eliphaz had just declared Job's hands guilty of taking pledges, withholding bread, and crushing the fatherless. If those hands became clean, they could become the means by which someone else was delivered. But to receive that future, Job had to accept Eliphaz's account of his past. Job answered by returning to the judge he still could not reach. Even now, he said, his complaint was bitter. The hand upon him was heavy, despite his groaning. If only he knew where to find God, he would go to God's seat. He would arrange his case before him and fill his mouth with arguments. Job wanted to learn the words God would use in reply. He wanted to understand what God would say to him. Would God contend with him by displaying overwhelming power? Job believed God would instead give attention to his case. There an upright man could reason with him, and Job would be delivered permanently from his judge. The hearing remained clear in Job's mind. He did not seek to overpower God. He wanted access, arguments, an answer, and a judgment based upon what he had actually done. But when Job moved forward, God was not there. When he went backward, he could not perceive him. When God worked on the left, Job could not behold him. When Job turned to the right, he did not see him. God knew the way Job took, even though Job could not find the way to God. When God tested him, Job said, he would emerge like gold. Job's foot had held firmly to God's steps. He had kept God's way and had not turned aside. He had not departed from the command of God's lips. He treasured God's words more than his necessary food. That was Job's answer to Eliphaz's accusations. Eliphaz had portrayed him as a man who believed God could not see. Job declared that God knew his path completely. Eliphaz said he had abandoned God's instruction. Job said he had treasured it above food. Yet Job's faithful conduct did not give him control over the outcome. God was one, and who could turn him? He did whatever he desired. God would complete what he had appointed for Job, and he held many such purposes. That knowledge terrified Job. When he considered God, he was afraid. God had made his heart faint, and the Almighty had filled him with terror. Job had not been cut off before darkness came. The thick darkness had covered his face, but life continued within it. Then Job widened his complaint from his own case to the public absence of judgment. Why did the Almighty not appoint times for judgment? Why did those who knew him fail to see his days of justice? People moved boundary markers, taking land by shifting its recognized limits. They seized flocks and pastured the stolen animals openly. They drove away the donkey belonging to an orphan and took a widow's ox as a pledge. They pushed the needy off the road. The poor of the land hid themselves together. Like wild donkeys in the wilderness, the poor went out to search for food. The wasteland supplied food for their children. They gathered fodder in fields and gleaned in vineyards belonging to the wicked. They spent the night naked because they lacked clothing. They had no covering against the cold. Mountain rains soaked them, and without shelter they clung to the rocks. Children without fathers were torn from the breast, and the infant of the poor was taken as security for debt. The poor went about naked and without clothing. Hungry, they carried bundles of grain. Within the walls of the wicked, they pressed out oil. They trod wine presses while suffering thirst. In the city, dying people groaned. The wounded cried for help. Yet God did not charge the oppressors with wrong. Job had moved far beyond examples of prosperous, wicked people. He described specific acts occurring without visible intervention: stolen land, seized animals, abusive pledges, displaced poor, hungry workers, exposed bodies, fatherless children taken, laborers producing oil and wine they could not enjoy, and wounded people crying out. These were the very kinds of offenses Eliphaz had just attributed to Job. Job did not deny that such oppression existed. He denied that its consequences arrived with the certainty the friends claimed. People committed those acts while their victims remained hungry, cold, thirsty, and unheard. Some offenders rebelled against the light. They refused to recognize its ways or remain upon its paths. The murderer rose before daylight and killed the poor and needy. At night, he acted as a thief. The eye of the adulterer waited for twilight. He said that no eye would see him and covered his face. Thieves broke into houses in the darkness. During the day, they shut themselves inside because they wanted nothing to do with the light. Morning was like deep darkness to them, for they were familiar with the terrors of darkness. Job then spoke of the end assigned to such people. They were swift upon the surface of the waters. Their portion of land was cursed, and they did not return to the vineyards. Drought and heat carried away melted snow, just as the grave carried away those who sinned. The womb forgot them. The worm fed sweetly upon them. Their names were remembered no more. Wickedness was broken like a tree. They preyed upon the childless woman and did no good for the widow. Yet God dragged away the mighty by his power. They could rise, but they had no assurance of life. God gave them security, and they were supported for a time, while his eyes remained upon their ways. They were exalted briefly, and then they were gone. They were brought low and gathered up like everyone else, cut off like heads of grain. Job ended with a challenge. If this was not so, who could prove him false and reduce his words to nothing? He did not claim that the wicked escaped forever. He had already said they entered the grave, were forgotten, and were cut down. His challenge concerned the path between wrongdoing and death. During that path, oppressors could move boundaries, seize pledges, exploit workers, and remain secure. Judgment did not always arrive at the moment of the crime, or reveal itself in a way that allowed observers to match suffering with guilt. That delay was enough to dismantle the friends' case against Job. They looked at his calamity and worked backward toward crimes. Job looked at actual crimes and showed that calamity did not consistently follow them. Eliphaz had finally named oppression, but naming it did not prove that Job had committed it. The accusations gave the friends a more specific explanation for his ruin, while leaving Job's central demand untouched. He still wanted God to reveal the charge. He still wanted to arrange his arguments before the judge. He still believed that God knew every step he had taken and that a true test would reveal him as gold. Yet every direction of his search remained empty of the encounter he wanted. And around him stretched a world in which the innocent could suffer openly, while those who wounded them continued for a time in security. The friends' formula was running out of room. Their next answer would have to explain not only Job's integrity, but the injustice he had placed before them. And their certainty was beginning to produce fewer words, not better ones. Bildad answered, but only briefly. Dominion and fear belong to God. God established peace in his heights. His armies could not be counted, and his light rose over everyone. How then could a human being be righteous before God? How could someone born of woman be pure? Even the moon was not bright before him, and the stars were not pure in his sight. How much less a man who was like a maggot, or a son of man who was like a worm? Bildad did not address the prosperous wicked, the oppressed poor, the delayed judgment, or the unsupported accusations Eliphaz had made. He returned to the difference between God and humanity. God was glorious, and human beings were lowly. Therefore, Job could not be righteous before him. Job answered with biting questions. How had Bildad helped the powerless? How had he saved an arm without strength? What counsel had he given to someone without wisdom? What great insight had he offered? Job asked whose words Bildad had spoken and whose breath had come from him. Bildad had appealed to God's greatness as though Job needed to be taught that greatness. Job answered with a vision of divine power far more expansive than Bildad's. The dead trembled beneath the waters, along with those who dwelt there. The grave lay naked before God, and destruction had no covering. God stretched the northern sky over empty space and suspended the earth upon nothing. He wrapped water within his clouds, yet the clouds did not split beneath its weight. He covered the face of his throne by spreading clouds over it. He drew a boundary upon the surface of the waters, marking the edge between light and darkness. The pillars of heaven trembled and were astonished at his rebuke. By his power he stilled the sea, and by his understanding he shattered Rahab, the symbol of raging chaos. By his breath the heavens became clear. His hand pierced the fleeing serpent. Job ended the description by calling these things only the outer edges of God's ways. Human beings heard only a faint whisper of him. Who could understand the thunder of his power? Job and Bildad agreed that God's greatness exceeded human comprehension. But Job refused the conclusion Bildad attached to it. Divine power did not prove that every suffering person was wicked. It proved that human beings saw only the edges of a government vast enough to include the heavens, the sea, the earth, the grave, and the forces of chaos. Job continued with a solemn oath. As God lives, who has denied me justice, and as the Almighty lives, who has made my soul bitter. The words held together the same conflict Job had refused to surrender. He swore by the life of God while declaring that God had denied him justice. He did not abandon God, and he did not withdraw his complaint. As long as breath remained within him and the breath of God stayed in his nostrils, Job's lips would not speak falsehood, and his tongue would not utter deceit. He would never declare that the friends were right. Until he died, he would not put away his integrity. Job held firmly to his righteousness and would not release it. His heart did not reproach him for any day of his life. The friends had asked him to confess. Eliphaz had accused him of taking pledges, stripping the poor, denying water and bread, dismissing widows, and crushing orphans. Job now placed his life beneath an oath and refused to validate those claims. To agree with them for the sake of promised restoration would itself require deceit. He asked that his enemy be treated as the wicked and his opponent as the unjust. What hope did a godless person have when God cut him off and took away his life? Would God hear his cry when distress came upon him? Would such a person delight in the Almighty and call upon God at all times? Job's own conduct beneath suffering stood inside those questions. He had cried to God repeatedly. He continued to direct his case toward the Almighty. He had sworn by God's life and treasured God's words. The godlessness his friends attributed to him did not match the man still demanding an encounter with God. Job told them he would teach them about God's power. He would not conceal what belonged to the Almighty. The friends had all seen it. Why then did they persist in empty reasoning? Job described the portion that awaited a wicked man with God, the inheritance a ruthless person received from the Almighty. If his children multiplied, they were destined for the sword. His descendants would lack bread. Those who survived him would be buried by death, and their widows would not weep for them. He could pile up silver like dust and gather clothing like clay. He might collect it, but the righteous would wear it, and the innocent would divide his silver. The house he built was as fragile as a moth's shelter or a temporary booth made by a watchman. He could lie down rich, but his wealth would not remain. He opened his eyes, and it was gone. Terrors overtook him like floodwaters. A storm carried him away during the night. The east wind lifted and removed him, sweeping him from his place. It hurled itself against him without mercy. He tried desperately to flee from its power. People clapped their hands at his fall and hissed him away from his place. Job did not deny that wickedness stood beneath judgment. He described divine judgment with the same images of lost children, hunger, vanished wealth, fragile homes, terror, storms, and removal that the friends had repeatedly used. The dispute concerned how those truths were applied. The friends had treated Job's experience as sufficient proof that he belonged among the wicked. Job had shown that wicked people could flourish and die in peace, that innocent and bitter sufferers shared the same grave, and that specific acts of oppression could continue without immediate punishment. Now he affirmed that ruthless people ultimately possessed no secure claim against God. Their gathered wealth could pass to the innocent. Their homes could fail. Their power could be swept away. But Job's oath still stood between him and the wicked man he described. His lips would not speak falsely. His conscience did not accuse him. He would not buy peace by confessing to conduct he denied. At this point, the question of wisdom rises above the entire dispute. Human beings knew how to search places hidden from ordinary sight. Silver had a mine, and gold had a place where it was refined. Iron was taken from the earth, and copper was smelted from ore. A miner brought an end to darkness. He searched the farthest limits for stone concealed in gloom and deep shadow. He opened a shaft far from inhabited places, in places forgotten by passing feet. Suspended away from others, men swung back and forth as they worked. The surface of the earth produced bread. Beneath it, the ground was transformed as though by fire. Its stones held sapphire, and its dust contained gold. A path led into those depths that no bird of prey knew. The falcon's eye had not seen it, proud beasts had not walked upon it, and the lion had not passed over it. Human hands attacked the flinty rock and overturned mountains at their roots. People cut channels through stone, and their eyes discovered precious things. They dammed underground streams and brought hidden treasures into the light. Human ingenuity could enter darkness, follow veins through rock, move water, overturn stone, and recover wealth buried beneath the earth. But where could wisdom be found? Where was the place of understanding? A human being did not know its value, and it could not be found in the land of the living. The deep said wisdom was not within it. The sea said it was not there. Wisdom could not be purchased with refined gold. Its price could not be measured in silver. The gold of Ophir could not equal it, nor could precious onyx or sapphire. Gold and glass could not compare with it. It could not be exchanged for vessels of fine gold. Coral and crystal were not worth mentioning beside it. The price of wisdom exceeded rubies. Topaz from Cush could not equal it, and the purest gold could not match its value. If wisdom could not be mined from the earth, drawn from the sea, or purchased with treasure. Where did it come from? Where was the place of understanding? It was hidden from the eyes of every living thing and concealed even from the birds of the sky. Destruction and death could only say that they had heard a rumor of it. God understood the way to wisdom. He knew its place. God saw to the ends of the earth and looked upon everything beneath the heavens. When he established the force of the wind and measured the waters, when he made a decree for the rain and marked a path for the thunderbolt, he saw wisdom and declared it. He established it and searched it out. Then he said to humanity, "The fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. To turn away from evil is understanding." The answer did not belong to mining skill, age, wealth, power, or eloquence. The friends had spoken as guardians of wisdom, but they could not reach God's purposes by following suffering backward into accusations. Job understood God's power, but he could not find the path into the divine counsel or force, open the hearing he wanted. Human beings could bring buried sapphires into daylight while remaining unable to uncover why one upright man had lost his children, possessions, health, and standing. They could weigh gold, but could not weigh Job's grief accurately. They could explore the roots of mountains, but not the full design of the God who governed wind and water. The one definition available to humanity returned to the qualities that had marked Job before disaster came: fear of the Lord and departure from evil. Job continued to claim both. His reverence had not silenced his complaint, and his complaint had not become the curse predicted against him. He feared God enough to demand truth rather than offer a false confession. He turned away from evil enough to refuse allegations that his conscience did not confirm. The friends' answers had contracted. Bildad had spoken only of divine dominion and human impurity. The explanations that once promised restoration, appealed to tradition, and described the fate of the wicked had reached their limit. Job's integrity remained in place, but his claim still required a fuller declaration. He had sworn that he would not release it. Now he would have to set his former life beside his present disgrace, name the conduct he denied, and place his entire case beneath judgment. Job began with the life he had lost. He longed for the months when God watched over him, when God's lamp shone above his head, and its light guided him through darkness. In those days, the friendship of God rested upon his tent. The Almighty was with him, and his children surrounded him. His paths seemed washed with cream, and rock poured out streams of oil for him. When Job went to the city gate and took his seat in the public square, young men saw him and stepped aside. The aged rose and remained standing. Princes stopped speaking and placed their hands over their mouths. The voices of nobles fell silent, and their tongues clung to the roofs of their mouths. People honored Job because they had seen what he did. He rescued the poor person who cried for help and the fatherless child who had no one to assist him. A person facing death blessed him, and he made the widow's heart sing. Job wore righteousness as clothing. Justice was like a robe and turban upon him. He became eyes for the blind and feet for the lame. He was a father to the needy, and when a stranger's case came before him, he investigated it. He broke the fangs of the unrighteous and pulled their victims from their teeth. This was Job's answer to Eliphaz's allegations. Eliphaz had accused him of denying bread and water, dismissing widows and crushing orphans. Job described a public life built around protecting those very people. His honor at the gate followed actions others could see. During those years, Job expected to die within his household, after multiplying his days like sand. His roots reached water, and dew rested upon his branches through the night. His glory remained fresh, and the bow in his hand was continually renewed. People listened when he spoke. They waited quietly for his counsel. After he finished, they did not add to his words. His speech fell upon them like rain, and they opened their mouths for it as the ground receives spring rain. When Job smiled at them, they could hardly believe the favor, and the light of his face encouraged them. He chose their way, sat as their chief, and lived among them like a king among his troops, like one who comforts mourners. Then Job placed that remembered honor beside his present humiliation. Men younger than he now mocked him, men whose fathers he would have disdained to place with the dogs guarding his flock. Their strength had brought him no benefit. Their vigor was gone. Gaunt from want and hunger, they gnawed at the dry ground in wasteland and desolation. They gathered plants from the bushes and used broom roots for food. They had been driven away from other people, who shouted after them as after a thief. They lived in ravines, holes in the ground, and among rocks. They cried out among the bushes and huddled beneath the undergrowth. Job called them the children of fools and nameless people who had been driven from the land. Now Job had become their song and their byword. They detested him, kept their distance, and did not hesitate to spit in his face. God had loosened Job's bowstring and humbled him, so these men cast off restraint in his presence. A rabble rose at his right hand, pushed away his feet, and built paths of destruction against him. They broke up his road and advanced his calamity. They came through a wide breach and rolled forward amid the ruins. Terrors turned upon Job. His honor was driven away like wind, and his prosperity passed like a cloud. His soul poured itself out within him. Days of affliction held him fast. At night, pain pierced his bones, and the gnawing within him did not rest. The force of his disease disfigured his clothing. It bound him like the collar of his garment. God had thrown him into the mire, and Job had become like dust and ashes. He cried to God and received no answer. He stood, and God looked at him. Job said God had turned cruel toward him and persecuted him with the strength of his hand. God lifted him into the wind, drove him before it, and tossed him in the storm. Job knew God was bringing him toward death, toward the house appointed for all the living. Yet Job had once wept for those in trouble. His soul had grieved for the poor. When he waited for good, evil came. When he looked for light, darkness arrived. His inward parts churned without rest. Days of suffering confronted him. His skin had grown dark, though not from the sun, and he stood in the assembly crying for help. He had become a brother to jackals and a companion to ostriches. His blackened skin fell from him, and his bones burned with heat. His lyre had been turned to mourning, and his pipe to the sound of weeping. Having placed his former conduct beside his present condition, Job submitted each major part of his life to judgment. He had made a covenant with his eyes. How then could he gaze lustfully at a young woman? What portion would such conduct receive from God above? What inheritance would come from the Almighty on high? Calamity awaited the unrighteous, and disaster those who practiced evil. God saw Job's ways and counted every step. If Job had walked with falsehood or hurried toward deceit, then let God weigh him on honest scales. God would know his integrity. If Job's step had turned away from the path, if his heart had followed his eyes, or if any stain clung to his hands, then someone else could eat what he had planted, and his crops could be uprooted. If his heart had been enticed by another woman, or if he had waited at his neighbor's door, then let his wife serve another man, and let other men bow over her. That conduct would be shameful, an offense worthy of judgment. It would be a fire consuming as far as destruction, burning through the entire harvest of his life. Job then addressed the use of authority within his household. If he had rejected the complaint of a male or female servant when either brought a case against him, what would he do when God rose to judge? What answer could he give when God called him to account? The same God had formed both master and servant in the womb. If Job had denied the desires of the poor, caused the widow's eyes to fail, or eaten his food alone without sharing with the fatherless, then his oath stood against him. But Job said the fatherless had grown up with him under his care, and from his youth he had guided the widow. If he had seen someone perish for lack of clothing, or watched a poor man without a covering, if that person's body had not blessed Job for warming him with wool from his sheep, then Job accepted judgment. If he had raised his hand against the fatherless because he saw that his influence at the gate would support him, then let his shoulder fall from its socket and his arm be broken from its joint. Job's former position had given him power where disputes were decided. He denied using that power to injure someone without protection. The possibility terrified him because he feared calamity from God and could not stand before divine majesty. Job examined the wealth that had once made him great. If he had made gold his hope, or called fine gold his security, if he had rejoiced because his wealth was great and his hand had acquired much, then he had placed trust in possessions rather than God. He examined the worship of creation. If he had looked upon the shining sun or the moon moving in splendor and allowed his heart to be secretly enticed, if his hand had kissed his mouth in reverence toward them, that too would have been an offense deserving judgment. He would have been false to God above. He examined his treatment of enemies. Job had not rejoiced when someone who hated him was ruined. He had not celebrated when trouble overtook his enemy. He had not permitted his mouth to sin by calling down a curse upon that person's life. He examined hospitality. The men of his tent could testify that people had been filled with Job's meat. A traveler did not have to spend the night in the street because Job opened his doors to the road. He examined concealment. If he had hidden his transgression as people do, covering guilt within himself because he feared a great crowd or dreaded the contempt of families, if that fear had kept him silent and confined him behind his door, then his claim could be exposed. But Job refused concealment. He wanted someone to hear him. He placed his mark upon the declaration. This was his signature. Let the Almighty answer him. If Job's accuser had written an indictment, Job would carry it upon his shoulder. He would bind it upon himself like a crown. He would give God an account of every step and approach him like a prince. Finally, Job called the land itself as a witness. If his land had cried out against him and its furrows had wept together, if he had consumed its produce without payment or caused its owners to lose their lives, then let thorns grow instead of wheat and foul weeds instead of barley. The oath reached across private desire, public justice, household authority, wealth, worship, enemies, hospitality, hidden guilt, and the use of land. Job did not offer a vague claim that he was better than other people. He named conduct that could be examined and attached consequences to each denial. He had protected the poor, fatherless, widows, blind, lame, dying, strangers, servants, travelers, and those facing unjust power. He denied sexual betrayal, deceit, greed, idolatry, revenge, concealment, unpaid consumption, and violence against landowners. His former honor had rested upon that visible life. His present disgrace had reversed the way people treated him without changing what he knew about his own conduct. Job had now done everything he could do without the hearing itself. He had asked for the charges. Eliphaz had supplied accusations. Job had answered with remembered actions and a sworn declaration. He had invited honest scales, named penalties against himself, and signed his demand for judgment. The dispute could no longer advance through another general portrait of wickedness. Job had placed his steps before God and asked the Almighty to answer. With that signed appeal, Job's words ended. The three men stopped answering Job because he remained righteous in his own eyes. But another man had been listening. His name was Elihu, the son of Barashel the Buzite, from the family of Ram. His anger burned against Job because Job had justified himself rather than God. His anger also burned against Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, because they had found no answer, yet they had condemned Job. Elihu was younger than the 4 men, so he had waited while they spoke. When he saw that the 3 friends had nothing more to say, his anger rose. He began by acknowledging the difference in age. He was young, and they were advanced in years. That was why he had been afraid to declare what he knew. He had expected accumulated days to speak and many years to teach wisdom. But age alone did not produce understanding. A spirit existed within a person, and the breath of the Almighty gave understanding. Great age did not guarantee wisdom, and old men did not automatically understand justice. So Elihu asked them to listen while he declared his opinion. He had waited through their words. He had listened to their reasoning as they searched for something to say. He had given them careful attention, yet none of them had refuted Job or answered his arguments. They should not claim that they had discovered wisdom by leaving Job for God to defeat. Job had not directed his words against Elihu, and Elihu would not answer him with the same arguments the friends had used. Elihu turned toward the 3 men as their failure became part of his own case. They were dismayed. They had no answer left. Words had failed them. Should Elihu continue waiting because they had stopped speaking? They stood there without another reply. He would give his answer. He would declare what he knew. He was full of words, and the spirit within him compelled him. His inward pressure was like wine sealed without an opening, like new wineskins ready to burst. He had to speak in order to find relief. He had to open his lips and answer. Elihu promised not to show partiality or flatter anyone. He did not know how to flatter. If he did, his maker would soon take him away. Then he addressed Job directly. Job should hear his words and listen to everything he said. Elihu had opened his mouth, and his tongue was ready to speak. His words came from an upright heart, and his lips would sincerely declare what he knew. The Spirit of God had made him, and the breath of the Almighty had given him life. If Job could answer, he should arrange his case and take his stand. Elihu was not asking Job to contend with an invisible terror. He stood before God in the same human condition as Job. He too had been formed from clay. His presence would not frighten Job, and his pressure would not weigh heavily upon him. That directly addressed one of Job's repeated objections. Job had wanted an arbiter who could place a hand upon both sides. He had asked God to remove the terror so that he could speak. Elihu did not claim to be the heavenly witness Job expected, but he did present himself as a fellow mortal whose words did not carry the crushing force Job feared. Elihu then repeated what he had heard Job say. Job had declared himself pure and without transgression, innocent and free from guilt. Yet God found occasions against him and counted him as an enemy. God placed his feet in stocks and watched all his paths. Those ideas came from Job's own complaints. Job had asked God to show his sin, said God treated him as an enemy, and described his feet confined and his paths watched. Elihu answered that Job was not right in making this charge because God was greater than any human being. Why did Job contend against God on the ground that God did not answer his words? Elihu introduced a different possibility. God did speak in one way and then another, even when a person did not recognize it. He spoke in a dream, in a vision during the night, when deep sleep fell upon people as they lay upon their beds. Then God opened human ears and sealed instruction upon them. The purpose was to turn a person away from a deed and keep pride from him. God preserved his soul from the pit and his life from death by the sword. That kind of warning did not wait until a person had completed a crime and received destruction. It intervened to redirect him. Divine communication could therefore be present without taking the form Job had demanded. Elihu then described another way a person could be corrected. A man was disciplined with pain upon his bed and with continual aching in his bones. His life recoiled from bread, and his appetite rejected desirable food. His flesh wasted away until it could no longer be seen, and bones once hidden stood out. His soul approached the pit, and his life drew near to those who brought death. The image resembled Job's condition: pain, rejected food, wasted flesh, visible bones, and nearness to the grave. But Elihu assigned suffering a purpose different from the simple retribution offered by the friends. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar had treated calamity as evidence pointing backward toward guilt. Elihu said affliction could also point forward, warning a person and turning him away from destruction. Then he introduced a messenger. If there was an angel beside the afflicted man, a mediator, one among 1,000, able to declare what was right for him, that figure could plead for mercy. Deliver him from going down to the pit. I have found a ransom. The movement was not from secret guilt to deserved death. It was from bodily collapse toward rescue. A mediator identified what was right, mercy intervened, and a ransom provided the ground for release. The man's flesh then became fresher than a child's. He returned to the days of youthful strength. He prayed to God and was accepted. He saw God's face with a shout of joy, and God restored him to a righteous standing. Afterward, the restored man looked upon other people and openly confessed what had happened. He had sinned and perverted what was right, yet he had not received the full consequence. God had redeemed his soul from descending into the pit, and his life looked upon the light. Elihu did not use this example to declare which offense Job had committed. He used it to challenge the assumption that pain could have only one meaning. The same physical decline the friends treated as proof of settled condemnation could function as intervention before death. God did such things repeatedly, Elihu said 2 or 3 times with a person. He turned the soul back from the pit so that the light of life could shine upon him. The claim changed the direction of the debate. The friends had told Job to infer his past from his suffering. Elihu told him to consider what God was doing through suffering in the present. Pain could expose human limits. It could open the ear. It could restrain pride, turn a person from a destructive act, and bring him to the place where mediation and mercy mattered. That did not answer Job's demand to know why his children died or why his possessions were destroyed. It did not reveal the challenge made beyond his sight. Elihu was addressing Job's charge that God had remained silent and treated him only as an enemy. God's speech, Elihu argued, was not limited to a direct appearance in court. A warning in the night and discipline through pain could communicate before a person recognized the communication. Yet Elihu also preserved the need Job had repeatedly expressed. The sufferer in his example did not rescue himself. He needed a messenger, a mediator, and a ransom. Someone had to declare what was right for him and speak the word that turned him back from the pit. Job had longed for an arbiter. He had appealed to a witness in heaven, an advocate on high, and a living redeemer. Elihu now described an intermediary, standing beside a dying man and announcing deliverance. But Elihu's mediator served a particular purpose. He did not place God on trial. He helped the human being understand correction and receive mercy. Elihu told Job to pay attention and listen. Job should remain silent while Elihu spoke, but if Job had something to say, he should answer. Elihu wanted Job to speak because he desired to justify him. If Job had no reply, he should continue listening. Elihu would teach him wisdom. The invitation distinguished Elihu from the 3 men who had exhausted their answers. He had repeated Job's claims closely enough to address them, and he allowed Job the opportunity to respond. He also rejected the friends' failure to defeat Job while condemning him anyway. Still, Elihu had taken a clear position. Job was wrong to accuse God of refusing to answer. Human greatness could not measure divine communication, and suffering did not have to mean that God had become an enemy. Elihu's alternative was more dynamic than the doctrine of immediate retribution. God warned, restrained, disciplined, mediated, ransomed, restored, and brought a person back to light. That vision gave affliction a possible movement toward rescue without making prosperity the automatic proof of innocence. It allowed a suffering person to be addressed before destruction rather than identified as wicked after it. But Elihu had only begun to confront Job's larger case. Job had accused God of denying justice while oppressors remained secure. He had described judges blinded, poor people displaced, workers exploited, and wounded people crying out. He had asked for the charge against himself and sworn to his conduct in every major part of life. To answer that challenge, Elihu would have to move beyond the way God speaks to one suffering person. He would have to defend the justice of God's government over rulers, nations, oppressors, and the human beings who demanded an explanation from him. Elihu continued by addressing everyone able to judge his words. Those who were wise should listen, and those with knowledge should hear him. The ear tested words just as the palate tasted food. Together they should determine what was right and learn what was good. Elihu then quoted the claims he believed Job had made. Job had said that he was righteous and that God had taken away his justice. He had asked whether he should lie about his right. His wound remained incurable even though he had committed no transgression. Elihu asked whether another man existed like Job, someone who drank mockery like water, kept company with evildoers, and walked with wicked men. He attributed another conclusion to Job, that a person gained nothing by delighting in God. Job had not abandoned his desire for God. He had continued to seek a hearing, treasured God's words, and expected to see him. But his argument had challenged the connection between conduct and visible outcome. Wicked people could prosper while an upright man suffered. Elihu heard that challenge as a denial that delighting in God benefited a person. So he asked the men of understanding to listen. Far be it from God to practice wickedness, and far be it from the Almighty to commit injustice. God repaid a person according to his work, and caused each one to receive according to his ways. God certainly did not act wickedly. The Almighty did not pervert justice. Elihu supported that claim by asking who had entrusted the earth to God, who had appointed him over the entire world. God did not rule under authority granted by someone else. No superior judge had assigned him a limited office. The earth and its inhabitants depended upon him. If God set his heart upon himself and gathered back his spirit and breath, all flesh would perish together and humanity would return to dust. The breath that sustained Job, Elihu, the friends, rulers, the poor, and the powerful remained God's. Divine government was therefore not one human interest competing with another. Every person appearing before that government received life from the one who judged. Elihu asked Job to hear this if he possessed understanding. Could someone who hated justice govern? Would Job condemn the righteous and mighty one? It was improper to say to a king, "You are worthless," or to call nobles wicked without cause. How much more should a person hesitate before condemning the one who showed no partiality toward princes and did not favor the rich over the poor, because all of them were the work of his hands? People died in a moment. In the middle of the night, communities were shaken and passed away. The mighty were removed without a human hand. God's eyes remained upon human ways, and he saw every step. No darkness or deep shadow allowed evildoers to hide. God did not need to appoint a time for a person to appear repeatedly before him in judgment. He broke mighty men without a prolonged investigation and placed others in their position. He knew their works. He overturned them during the night and they were crushed. He struck them for their wickedness where others could see. The reason was that they had turned away from following him and refused to consider any of his ways. Their conduct caused the cry of the poor to reach God, and God heard the cry of the afflicted. Elihu directly confronted Job's examples. Job had described powerful people moving boundaries, taking pledges, driving the needy from the road, and making wounded people cry out. Elihu insisted that concealment and power did not remove them from divine sight. Their every step remained visible, and the cry they caused reached God. But God's action was not controlled by human demand. When God gave quietness, who could condemn him? When he hid his face, who could behold him? The same authority extended over a nation and over an individual. God acted so that a godless person would not reign and set traps for the people. Elihu's defense did not promise that every act of oppression would receive immediate public punishment. He argued that delay did not mean blindness. God knew the work, heard the afflicted, removed rulers, and governed the conditions under which individuals and nations continued. Then Elihu considered the kind of response appropriate for someone under discipline. Had a person ever said to God, "I have borne correction, I will not offend again. Teach me what I cannot see. If I have committed injustice, I will do it no more." Elihu asked whether God should repay on Job's terms because Job rejected his judgment. The choice belonged to Job, not to Elihu. Job should declare what he knew. Elihu appealed again to people of understanding. Every wise person listening to him would say that Job spoke without knowledge and that his words lacked insight. He wanted Job examined completely because Job answered like wicked men. Job added rebellion to his sin, Elihu said. He clapped his hands among them in defiance and multiplied words against God. The accusation did not repeat the crimes Eliphaz had named. Elihu's concern was Job's response beneath suffering. Job claimed righteousness and demanded terms from God. Elihu believed that this speech crossed from honest complaint into rebellion. Yet the corrective response Elihu proposed differed from a false confession. The suffering person should ask to be taught what he could not see and promise to turn from any injustice revealed. Elihu did not tell Job to invent guilt. He told him to accept that God could see what Job did not. Then Elihu addressed Job once more. Did Job consider it just to say that his righteousness exceeded God's? Job had asked what advantage righteousness gave him and what benefit came from avoiding sin. Elihu said he would answer Job and the friends with him. Look toward the heavens, see the clouds high above. If Job sinned, what did he accomplish against God? If his transgressions multiplied, what did he do to God? If Job was righteous, what did he give to God? What did God receive from his hand? Human wickedness injured other human beings. Human righteousness benefited other people. God was not enriched by Job's integrity or weakened by another person's sin. That meant God's judgment was not the reaction of a vulnerable ruler defending a private advantage. The consequences of human conduct moved most immediately through human lives. People cried out beneath many oppressions. They called for help because of the arm of the mighty. Yet Elihu said they did not ask, "Where is God, my Maker, who gives songs in the night, who teaches us more than the animals of the earth and makes us wiser than the birds of the sky?" Elihu had earlier said that animals and birds could teach. Here he placed human understanding above theirs because God gave instruction to humanity. The oppressed cried out, but God did not answer an empty cry produced by the pride of evil people. God did not hear falsehood, and the Almighty did not regard it. Elihu's words required more than the existence of a cry. They turned attention toward the person calling and the God being addressed. A demand shaped by pride did not compel God merely because it was spoken beneath distress. How much less, Elihu told Job, would God answer when Job said he could not see him? Job's case was already before God. Job needed to wait for him. That was Elihu's answer to the search Job had described. Job had gone forward, backward, left and right without finding God. Elihu did not interpret that hiddenness as abandonment. The case remained before God even while Job could not see the judge. Job had also said that God's anger did not punish the wicked and that God took little notice of great wickedness. Elihu rejected that conclusion. Job had opened his mouth with empty talk and multiplied words without knowledge. The disagreement now centered on what divine silence meant. Job believed his suffering demanded an answer because the visible pattern did not reveal justice. He saw wicked people secure, poor people displaced, and his own upright life devastated. He wanted God to appear, name the charge, and hear his defense. Elihu insisted that God's hiddenness did not cancel God's knowledge. God saw every path, heard the afflicted, judged rulers, and governed nations. A case could remain before him even when the person waiting could not perceive his action. Elihu also denied that human conduct changed God's position in the way it changed human lives. Job's righteousness did not purchase a claim upon God. The wicked person's sin did not injure God as it injured a neighbor, servant, widow, worker, or child. That argument answered one part of Job's complaint. The absence of immediate judgment did not mean God had failed to see. The prosperity of an oppressor did not make the oppressor independent of the one who supplied every breath. But another part remained. If God saw, heard, and governed without partiality, why did the cries continue? Why did a righteous sufferer experience silence as hostility? Why did pain become the means through which a person was expected to learn? Elihu had defended God against the charge of wickedness. He had said that rulers and nations remained beneath divine government, that concealment could not hide conduct, and that human beings depended upon God for life itself. He had not yet completed his explanation of affliction. To do that, he would have to return to pain, not simply as punishment or evidence, but as instruction, and then place that instruction beneath the vast power displayed in rain, wind, thunder, and storm. Elihu asked Job to bear with him a little longer. He still had something to say on God's behalf. He would draw his knowledge from far away and ascribe righteousness to his Maker. His words were sincere, Elihu said, and a man of sound knowledge stood before Job. God was mighty, but he did not despise anyone. His power was joined with complete understanding. He did not preserve the life of the wicked, but he gave justice to the afflicted. He did not withdraw his eyes from the righteous. He seated them with kings upon thrones and exalted them. But when people were bound in chains and caught in cords of affliction, God showed them what they had done and where pride had shaped their transgression. He opened their ears to instruction and commanded them to turn away from evil. If they listened and served him, they completed their days in prosperity and their years in pleasantness. If they refused to listen, they passed away by the sword and died without knowledge. The godless in heart stored up anger. When God bound them, they did not cry for help. Their lives ended in disgrace. But God delivered the afflicted through their affliction and opened their ears through oppression. That was the heart of Elihu's alternative. Affliction was not limited to repaying a completed offense. God could use the suffering itself to open a person's ear. The same distress that confined someone could become the means through which God instructed and delivered. Elihu applied this directly to Job. God was drawing him away from distress toward a broad place without confinement, toward a table filled with rich food. But Job had become occupied with the judgment of the wicked, and judgment and justice had seized him. Elihu warned him not to let wrath entice him into scoffing. The greatness of any ransom should not turn him aside. Would Job's riches keep him from distress? Would all the force of his strength be enough? His former wealth had not protected him. Neither gold nor human power could remove the pressure beneath which he now spoke. Job should not long for the night when people vanished from their place. He needed to take care not to turn toward iniquity, choosing defiance rather than enduring affliction. Elihu believed Job stood at a dangerous point. Pain could open his ear, but anger could also harden into rebellion. The meaning of the affliction would therefore appear in the direction Job took beneath it. God was exalted in power. Who was a teacher like him? Who had appointed God's way for him? Who could accuse him of doing wrong? Elihu told Job to remember to magnify God's work that people celebrated in song. Everyone looked upon it. Humanity saw it from a distance. God was great beyond human knowledge. The number of his years could not be searched out. Then Elihu moved from human affliction to the workings of the world above them. God drew up drops of water. They distilled as rain from the mist. Clouds poured down their moisture and showered it abundantly upon humanity. Could anyone understand how the clouds spread or how thunder came from God's dwelling? God scattered lightning around himself and covered the depths of the sea. Through these things he judged peoples and also gave food in abundance. He filled his hands with lightning and commanded it to strike its appointed target. Thunder announced his presence, and even the livestock reacted to what approached. The same power that corrected also sustained. Rain supplied food, storms brought judgment, lightning reached the place assigned to it. Human beings received the water but did not control the path by which it came. At this, Elihu said, his heart trembled and leaped from its place. He called Job to listen carefully to the thunder of God's voice and the rumbling that came from his mouth. God sent it beneath the entire heaven and released his lightning to the ends of the earth. After the flash came the roar. God thundered with his majestic voice, and when that voice was heard, the lightning was not restrained. God thundered wonderfully. He performed great things that human beings could not comprehend. He commanded the snow to fall upon the earth. He spoke to the rain and to the mighty downpour. Such weather stopped human labor. God sealed the hand of every person so that all people would recognize his work. Animals entered their shelters and remained within their dens. A storm came from its chamber, and cold arrived with scattering winds. By the breath of God, ice formed, and broad waters became frozen. God loaded thick clouds with moisture and scattered clouds carrying his lightning. They turned according to his guidance and accomplished whatever he commanded across the inhabited world. He caused them to come for correction, for the needs of his land, or for steadfast love. The clouds did not move under human instruction. The same rain could serve different purposes within God's government. It could correct, water the earth, or express care. The people beneath it received the result without directing its route. Elihu told Job to listen and stand still. Consider the wondrous works of God. Did Job know how God commanded the clouds or caused lightning to flash? Did he understand the balancing of the clouds, the wondrous work of one perfect in knowledge? Job experienced the heat of his garments when the earth became still under the south wind. But could he join God in spreading out the skies, hard like a mirror of cast metal? Elihu asked Job to teach them what they should say to God. Because of their darkness, they could not arrange their case. Should God be told that Elihu wanted to speak? Would anyone ask to be swallowed up? At times, people could not look upon the bright light in the sky when the wind had passed and cleared the clouds. Golden splendor came from the north, and around God was awesome majesty. The Almighty remained beyond human reach. He was exalted in power, justice, and abundant righteousness. He did not violate justice, therefore people feared him. He did not regard those who were wise in their own hearts. Elihu had begun as the youngest person present, reluctant to speak before older men. He ended by placing every speaker beneath a wisdom none of them possessed. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar had looked at Job's ruin and claimed they could identify its cause. Job had looked at his integrity and demanded that God justify the ruin. Elihu insisted that both divine action and human suffering belonged to a government too great to be measured by immediate appearances. Rain did not serve only one purpose. Clouds could come for correction, for the land, or for steadfast love. In the same way, Elihu refused to let affliction carry only the meaning the friends assigned to it. Pain could discipline. It could open the ear. It could expose pride. It could turn a person away from destruction. With a mediator and a ransom, a dying sufferer could be restored to light. Yet Elihu did not reduce God's justice to that single purpose either. God saw rulers and the poor, nations and individuals, concealed evil and public cries. He could remove the mighty without human hands and give justice to the afflicted. The unanswered difficulty remained within that defense. Job was still afflicted. His children remained dead. His former household had been destroyed. The three friends had accused him, and Elihu had now accused his words of crossing into rebellion. Elihu had offered instruction, but Job had asked for encounter. Job wanted to know why God contended with him. He wanted the charges named, his conduct weighed, and his arguments heard. He wanted the terror restrained so that he could speak. He wanted his witness, advocate, and living Redeemer to stand. Elihu told him that God already saw, already knew, and already communicated through means Job had not recognized. He told Job to wait with his case before God and to consider the works human beings could observe without comprehending. Snow, rain, wind, ice, clouds, lightning, and thunder all moved at commands beyond human reach. People saw the results from below. They could not direct the forces or assign their full purpose. The comparison placed Job in the same position beneath divine government. He experienced the force. He saw what it had removed. He felt what it did to his body, but he did not stand where the command was given. Elihu's answer therefore ended at the boundary of human explanation. He could defend God's justice, warn Job against pride, and show that suffering had more than one possible function. He could not give Job access to the purpose hidden from him. The thunder Elihu described remained part of his declaration of divine majesty. He had not become the voice from heaven Job sought. He was still a man formed from clay, speaking to another man formed from clay. His contribution had clarified the choice before Job. Job could turn his pain into a final judgment against God, or he could accept that the Almighty's understanding exceeded his own and listen for instruction within affliction. But Job's signed demand still stood. His oath had not been withdrawn. His case had not been heard in the encounter he requested. Elihu had spoken of the thunder of God's voice, and Job was still waiting to hear that voice for himself. Then the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind. The voice Job had demanded finally addressed him. "Who is this who darkens counsel with words without knowledge?" Job had accused God, defended himself, questioned the order of the world, and signed his demand for a hearing. Now God told him to prepare himself like a man. God would ask the questions and Job would answer. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? If Job possessed understanding, he should declare it. Who determined the earth's measurements? Surely Job knew. Who stretched a measuring line across it? Upon what were its foundations sunk? Who laid its cornerstone? When that foundation was placed, the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. The questions took Job beyond his own beginning to the beginning of the world beneath him. Job had described human beings as formed from clay and appointed to brief lives. God asked where Job stood when the ground supporting every human life was established. Then God turned to the sea. Who enclosed it behind doors when it burst from the womb? God made clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling cloth. He fixed limits for it, set bars and doors in place, and commanded its waves to come this far and no farther. Job had spoken of calamity like floodwater and of God's power over the sea. Now God described the sea itself as something born, clothed, restrained, and given a boundary. Its waves possessed force, but their reach was limited by a command Job had never issued. Had Job ever commanded the morning or shown the dawn its place? The dawn took hold of the edges of the earth and shook the wicked from it. Under its light, the earth changed like clay beneath a seal, and its features appeared like the folds of a garment. Light was withheld from the wicked, and the arm raised for violence was broken. Job had asked why people who rebelled against light continued in darkness. God placed even the daily arrival of light within a government that exposed and restrained evil. Every morning arrived by an authority beyond Job's command. Had Job entered the springs of the sea or walked through the recesses of the deep? Had the gates of death been revealed to him? Had he seen the gates of deep darkness? Job had repeatedly spoken of the grave as the destination toward which he moved. God asked whether Job had actually inspected its gates. Had Job comprehended the breadth of the earth? If so, he should declare all he knew. Where was the way to the dwelling of light? Where did darkness reside? Could Job take each one to its territory and recognize the paths to its home? Surely Job knew, God said, because Job had been born then, and the number of his days was so great. The force of the questions did not depend only upon scale. Job had spoken confidently about light, darkness, life, and death. God asked him for their locations, boundaries, entrances, and paths. The things Job used to describe his suffering belonged to an order he could experience but could not administer. Had Job entered the storehouses of snow or seen the storehouses of hail? God had reserved them for times of trouble, for days of battle and war. What was the way by which light was distributed? How was the east wind scattered across the earth? Who cut a channel for torrents and marked a path for the thunderbolt? Who sent rain upon a land where no person lived, upon a wilderness without human inhabitants, satisfying a desolate waste and causing grass to grow? Rain did not fall only upon fields people worked or places they could observe. It reached wilderness where human need did not explain its arrival. Life emerged there under care that was not organized around Job or any other person. Did rain have a father? Who produced the drops of dew? From whose womb came ice? Who gave birth to the frost of heaven? Water became hard like stone, and the surface of the deep was frozen. The world Job knew was filled with transformations he could name but could not produce. Mist becoming rain, water becoming ice, darkness yielding to dawn, clouds carrying moisture, and dry wilderness producing grass. Could Job bind the cluster of the Pleiades or loosen the cords of Orion? Could he bring out the constellations in their season or guide the bear with her children? Did Job know the ordinances of the heavens? Could he establish their rule upon the earth? The stars Job saw were not decorations within a human sky. Their ordered movements belonged to laws Job had not established. He could observe their seasons without calling them into place. Could Job raise his voice to the clouds and command a flood of water to cover him? Could he send lightning so that it went forth and reported, "Here we are"? Who placed wisdom within and gave understanding to the mind? Who could number the clouds by wisdom? Who tilted the vessels of heaven when the dust became hard and the clods of earth held together? The questions moved from cosmic structure to immediate provision. Could Job hunt prey for a lioness, or satisfy the hunger of young lions when they crouched in their dens and waited within their thickets? Who supplied food for the raven when its young cried to God and wandered without anything to eat? Job had spoken of God as one who governed kings, nations, seas, and stars. Now, divine attention descended to hungry animals concealed in dens and young birds searching for food. Their needs existed beyond human households, yet they were included within the same government that set the earth's foundations. God continued, "Did Job know when mountain goats gave birth? Had he watched deer in labor? Could he count the months of their pregnancies and determine the time when they delivered? They crouched, brought forth their young, and released the pains of birth. Their young became strong in the open country. They went out and did not return. These births occurred in places Job did not supervise. The animals carried their young, delivered them, and watched them depart under knowledge and timing that did not come from him. Who released the wild donkey and untied its bonds? God gave the wilderness as its home and the salt land as its dwelling. It laughed at the noise of the city and did not hear the shouts of a driver. It searched the hills for pasture and looked for every green thing. The wild donkey did not serve the organized labor of a household. It lived beyond the driver's command, not as a failure of order, but as a creature given its own place. Would the wild ox agree to serve Job? Would it spend the night beside his feeding trough? Could Job bind it with ropes to plow a furrow? Would it follow him through the valleys? Could Job trust it because its strength was great and leave his labor to it? Could he depend upon it to bring grain back and gather it at the threshing floor? Raw strength did not equal willing service. Job had once owned 500 yoke of oxen, animals used for labor. The wild ox possessed great power, but did not place that power beneath Job's direction. Then God described the ostrich. Its wings flapped proudly, though they did not carry the faithful plumage of the stork. It left its eggs upon the ground and allowed them to be warmed in the dust. It forgot that a foot could crush them or that a wild animal could trample them. It treated its young harshly as though they did not belong to it. Its labor could be in vain, yet it felt no terror, because God had deprived it of wisdom and had not given it understanding. But when the ostrich rose to run, it laughed at the horse and rider. The creature appeared deficient in one quality and extraordinary in another. Its treatment of eggs did not display the care seen in other animals, yet its speed surpassed the mounted rider. It occupied a place in creation that could not be reduced to the single standard Job might apply. Had Job given the horse its strength or clothed its neck with a mane? Had he made it leap like a locust? Its majestic snorting inspired fear. It pawed the valley and rejoiced in its strength. It charged forward to meet weapons. The horse laughed at fear and was not terrified. It did not turn back from the sword. A quiver rattled against it, along with the flashing spear and javelin. With fierce excitement it swallowed the ground. When the trumpet sounded, it could not stand still. At every blast it cried out and smelled the battle from far away, hearing the thunder of commanders and the shouting. The horse's courage, speed, strength, and response to battle had not been placed within it by Job. The animal entered danger with qualities its human rider depended upon but had not created. Did the hawk soar by Job's wisdom and spread its wings toward the south? Did the eagle mount up at Job's command and build its nest in the heights? It lived upon a cliff and spent the night there, making the rocky crag its stronghold. From that height it searched for food, and its eyes detected prey from far away. Its young drank blood, and wherever the slain lay, the eagle was there. The questions crossed the inhabited earth without centering human comfort. Predators hunted, young lions waited for flesh, ravens cried for food, wild donkeys rejected control, wild oxen withheld their strength from human work. Ostriches left eggs vulnerable, war horses rushed toward weapons, eagles gathered where bodies had fallen. This was not an orderly world, because every creature behaved gently. It was an order vast enough to contain hunger, birth, freedom, danger, speed, violence, provision, and death, without placing all of them beneath human management. Job had repeatedly asked why God preserved the lives of people who suffered and why wicked people escaped immediate punishment. God's questions did not give him a list matching each event to its cause. They placed Job's moral demand within the breadth of a world whose administration extended far beyond the evidence available to one sufferer. Job knew how a disaster felt from the ground. He knew the death of children, The loss of wealth, the collapse of standing, the pain of disease, and the cruelty of accusation. He did not know how to command dawn, limit seas, direct stars, measure rain, feed ravens, time the birth of mountain goats, or govern the instincts of wild creatures. The distinction was not between a God who understood suffering and a man who did not. Job understood his suffering with an intimacy his friends had failed to respect. The distinction was between experiencing one part of the world and governing the whole of it. God had heard Job's words. The whirlwind itself answered Job's claim that God would not engage him. But the form of the answer reversed the courtroom Job had imagined. Job had wanted to arrange his arguments. God told Job to prepare for questions. Job had wanted the indictment. God asked him for knowledge. Job had wanted to know why his path was hidden. God asked whether he knew the paths of light, darkness, storms, and constellations. Job had asked for an arbiter to restrain divine terror. God addressed him from the whirlwind and required him to stand as a man. The questions did not accuse Job of taking pledges, neglecting widows, crushing orphans, worshipping wealth, or committing the offenses he had denied. God challenged the scope of Job's understanding and the authority with which he had judged divine government. Then the Lord addressed him directly as the one who had contended with the Almighty. Should a fault finder argue with God? Let the person who reproved God answer. The demand brought the entire dispute to a point. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar had accused Job of wickedness. Job had answered them with his conduct and oath. Elihu had accused Job's words of becoming rebellious. Job had asked God to hear the case. Now God identified Job not as the oppressor described by Eliphaz, but as a man who had found fault with the Almighty. The issue before him was no longer whether the friends could prove secret crimes. It was whether Job possessed the knowledge required to condemn the government of God. Job answered, "Behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you?" He placed his hand over his mouth. He had spoken once and would not answer. He had spoken twice and would proceed no further. The man who once feared he could not speak beneath divine terror had now heard the voice he demanded. The questions did not crush him into death. They brought him to silence. Job's hand over his mouth did not erase everything he had said. His children were still dead. His body still bore affliction. His friends had still accused him. His longing for justice had been real. But Job could no longer speak as though his view of suffering gave him a complete view of the world. The one he had summoned described foundations Job never witnessed, boundaries he never set, creatures he never governed, and purposes extending into places where no human being lived. Job had asked, "Who is the Almighty, and how does he govern?" The answer stood before him as a voice commanding seas, dawn, weather, stars, birth, hunger, wilderness, and wild strength. Job recognized the difference between his questions and the knowledge required to answer them, so he covered his mouth. But the Lord had asked whether the fault finder would contend with the Almighty. Job had declared himself small and withdrawn from speaking further. God had not yet released him from the confrontation. One issue remained at the center of Job's case, his accusation that divine justice had failed, and the voice from the whirlwind was not finished. Then the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind a second time. "Prepare yourself like a man. I will question you, and you will answer me." The challenge now turned directly toward justice. Would Job discredit God's justice? Would he condemn God in order to justify himself? If Job was ready to judge the government of the Almighty, then he needed the power required to carry out that judgment. Did he possess an arm like God's? Could his voice thunder like the voice of God? Job should adorn himself with majesty and dignity. He should clothe himself with glory and splendor. He should pour out the fury of his anger, look upon every proud person and bring that person low. Look upon everyone proud and humble him. Crush the wicked where they stood. hide them together in the dust and bind their faces in the hidden place. If Job could do that, God would acknowledge that Job's own right hand could save him. The challenge joined justice to complete knowledge and irresistible power. Job had identified outcomes that seemed unjust. God required more than the ability to recognize suffering. To govern justice across the earth, Job would have to find every proud person, distinguish every wicked person, humble them at the proper time, and carry out judgment without error. Job could not condemn God merely by claiming that he would govern the world differently. He would have to demonstrate the power to do what he demanded. God then directed Job toward Behemoth. "Look at Behemoth, which I made along with you." The creature ate grass like an ox. Its strength rested in its loins, and its power filled the muscles of its belly. It stiffened its tail like a cedar. The sinews of its thighs were tightly woven, its bones were tubes of bronze, and its limbs were like bars of iron. Behemoth ranked first among the works of God. Only its maker could approach it with the sword. The mountains produced food for it, while the wild animals played there. It lay beneath lotus plants, hidden among reeds in the marsh. Lotus trees covered it with shade, and willows beside the stream surrounded it. If a river raged, Behemoth was not alarmed. It remained secure even if the Jordan surged against its mouth. Could anyone capture it while it watched? Could anyone pierce its nose with a snare? Job was invited to look, but not to rule. Behemoth shared the created world with him, yet its strength exceeded his control. It could stand securely where rushing water threatened other creatures. The one who made Job also made this immense animal, equipped it, fed it through the mountains, and gave it a place among marshes and rivers. Then God turned to Leviathan. Could Job draw Leviathan out with a fishhook? Could he press down its tongue with a cord? Could he put a rope through its nose or pierce its jaw with a hook? Would Leviathan make repeated pleas to Job? Would it speak gentle words to him? Would it make a covenant to serve Job for life? Could Job play with it as he would play with a bird? Could he put it on a leash for girls to lead? Would traders bargain over it? Would merchants divide it among themselves? Could Job fill its hide with harpoons or its head with fishing spears? If he laid a hand upon Leviathan, he would remember the battle and never do it again. The hope of subduing it was false. The mere sight of it overwhelmed a person. No one was fierce enough to stir Leviathan safely. Who then can stand before me? The creature was not equal to its maker. Its power became a measure of the greater power required to create and govern it. Who had given something to God first, placing God under obligation to repay. Everything beneath heaven belonged to him. God continued describing Leviathan's limbs, strength, and formidable shape. Who could strip away its outer covering? Who could approach its double armor? Who could open the doors of its face? Its teeth inspired terror. Its back carried rows of scales like shields, sealed tightly together. One scale stood so close to another that air could not pass between them. They were joined firmly and could not be separated. Its sneezing flashed with light, and its eyes resembled the first light of dawn. Flames seemed to leap from its mouth, and sparks of fire shot forth. Smoke poured from its nostrils like steam from a boiling pot over burning reeds. Its breath kindled coals, and flame came from its mouth. Strength rested in its neck, and terror moved before it. The folds of its flesh held firmly together. They were fixed and immovable. Its heart was hard as stone, hard as the lower millstone. When Leviathan raised itself, even the mighty were afraid. They lost their composure before its crashing. A sword struck it without effect. Spears, darts, and javelins could not prevail. It regarded iron as straw and bronze as rotten wood. Arrows did not make it flee. Stones from a sling became like chaff against it. Clubs seemed like straw, and it laughed at the rattling javelin. Its underside was like sharp pieces of broken pottery. As it moved through mud, it left a trail like a threshing sledge. It made the deep churn like a boiling pot and stirred the sea like a vessel of ointment. Behind it, a shining wake appeared, making the deep look white-haired. Nothing on earth equaled it as a creature without fear. It looked down upon everything lofty and stood as king over all the proud. The challenge was not that Job should become behemoth or leviathan. It was that he could not master them. Job had asked to stand before the one governing the world. God showed him creatures before which human weapons failed. Hooks, ropes, swords, spears, arrows, stones, and clubs did not make Leviathan a servant. Traders could not divide it as merchandise. A human being who touched it entered a battle he would remember. Yet Leviathan remained a creature. Every scale, muscle, tooth, and movement belonged beneath the God speaking from the whirlwind. If Job could not capture one creature within the world, he could not claim the capacity to govern every proud and violent power within it. If he could not command Behemoth beside the river or Leviathan in the deep, he could not clothe himself with divine majesty and execute universal justice by his own right hand. The questions had reached the foundation of Job's accusation. He had condemned God's government in order to preserve the truth of his own integrity. God had not asked him to confess the crimes alleged by the three friends. He had asked whether Job's righteousness gave him the knowledge and power to judge the Almighty. Job answered the Lord, "I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be restrained." Then he repeated the question God had asked him. Who is this who hides counsel without knowledge? Job recognized himself within it. He had spoken of things he did not understand, things too wonderful for him, which he did not know. He repeated God's command as well. Hear, and I will speak. I will question you, and you will answer me. Before this encounter, Job had heard of God by the hearing of the ear. Now his eye saw him. Therefore Job retracted what he had said and repented in dust and ashes. His response went beyond placing a hand over his mouth. Silence had acknowledged his smallness. Repentance acknowledged that he had spoken beyond his knowledge. Job did not confess that he had oppressed the poor, seized houses, dismissed widows, or crushed the fatherless. God had not charged him with those things. Job withdrew his attempt to judge purposes he could not comprehend. The encounter he demanded had changed him. He had expected to present his case and hear God answer his charges. Instead, God's questions revealed the distance between Job's knowledge and the wisdom required to administer creation. Job now knew two things directly. God's power could not be restrained, and Job had spoken of purposes too wonderful for him. After speaking to Job, the Lord addressed Eliphaz the Temanite. God's anger burned against Eliphaz and his two friends because they had not spoken rightly about him as Job had. The men who had claimed to defend divine justice now received God's judgment upon their words. Their certainty had not made their accusations true. Their portraits of wickedness had not explained Job. Their efforts to defend God had misrepresented the man they condemned and the God they claimed to understand. The Lord commanded them to take 7 bulls and 7 rams and go to Job. They were to offer the animals as a burnt offering for themselves. Then Job would pray for them. God would accept Job's prayer and refrain from dealing with them according to their folly. Once again, the Lord stated the reason. They had not spoken rightly about him as Job had. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar did what the Lord commanded. They went to the man they had treated as a godless offender. Their relationship to him had been reversed by divine judgment. They had urged Job to repent so that he could be restored. Now they came with sacrifices because God required them to seek acceptance through Job's intercession. Job prayed for his friends. The Lord accepted his prayer. The vindication Job had demanded therefore arrived in an unexpected form. God did not merely declare the friends mistaken and send them away. He placed their restoration into a relationship with the man they had wounded. Job did not answer their accusations with punishment. He interceded. When Job prayed for his friends, the Lord restored his fortunes. God gave him twice as much as he had possessed before. Then Job's brothers and sisters came to him, along with everyone who had known him before. They ate bread with him in his house. They showed him sympathy and comforted him concerning all the calamity the Lord had brought upon him. Each person gave Job a piece of money and a gold ring. The relationships that had failed during his humiliation now took visible form around his table. His relatives and former acquaintances entered his house, shared food, acknowledged his suffering, and brought gifts. The Lord blessed the later part of Job's life more than the former part. Job received 14,000 sheep, twice the 7,000 he had once possessed. He received 6,000 camels, twice the 3,000 he had owned. He received 1,000 yoke of oxen, twice the 500 yoke that had worked his land. He received 1,000 female donkeys, twice the 500 that had grazed beside them. The restoration was exact in its scale. The animals placed within the accuser's reach were returned in doubled numbers. Job again possessed the working wealth of a great household, but the numbers now carried the visible mark of reversal. Job also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He named his first daughter Jemimah, the second Keziah, and the third Keren-Happuch. No women in all the land were found as beautiful as Job's daughters. Job gave them an inheritance alongside their brothers. Their names were preserved, and their place within the restored household included property as well as family belonging. Job's future did not consist only of animals and accumulated wealth. Sons and daughters again filled his life, and the daughters received a share among their brothers. After this, Job lived another 140 years. He saw his sons, and then their sons, through 4 generations. Then Job died, an old man and full of days.